one day I might not be able to remember these stories, but I can look up at that fly on the wall with a tag and think, oh yeah, I caught that fly right there, the Rambler Muddler. We were on that eastern river in the evening, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see the fly anymore because it was so dark. So I gave a location twitch where I stripped the line in, and the fly burped up to the surface, and the steelhead was on. And so I want to remember those moments. So yeah, I have a whole pile of flies on the wall. Well, a whole pile of flies, not even on the wall yet, that I need to tag before I forget the stories. And yeah, it makes steelheading special for me.
Welcome to In the Bucket, the podcast that explores the culture of spay fishing in the Pacific Northwest, a spectacular land of mountains and wild rivers where every cast has a story to tell. I'm your host, Brian Niska. In today's show, I'm going to be speaking with two of the nicest gentlemen in all of spay fishing. Of course, I'm talking about dry fly magician Adrian Cortes and his very good buddy Richard Harrington, host of the River Rambler podcast. I'm really looking forward to chatting steelhead, bamboo rods, and dry flies with these two legends. Let's get into it. Right on, folks. Thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited to have Richard Harrington and Adrian Cortes on the show with me today. Richard, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
See, I'll talk all day, and as soon as it's about me, I'm like, I don't really want to talk. I live just outside of Portland, Oregon City for a little while yet. I grew up out all around the Northwest, and then in high school, my family moved to New York, and it took me 40 years to get back here. So my steelheading started out here completely ineffectively, and then I started fishing in New York when the Great Lakes were really just kind of taking off. I graduated from high school in 1977, so I think Adrian was still in diapers, if even born yet. But fishing is like the kind of constant in my life. I did have one stretch where I quit for a while. Life was just kind of too hard, and fishing, it gives you a lot of contemplation time. I paint and do printmaking for a living, which is not something I ever planned to do. It's just the way it turned out. And we started the podcast about 5 years ago, I think, prompting insistence of my eldest daughter, who produces podcast, or did. She since has people produce podcasts for her in New York, and decided, because the curse of her father is that I've always enjoyed visiting. And she said, Dad, you'd be a perfect podcast host. And I said, I don't really know what they are. And my son is our producer, and none of it would happen if it weren't for him. And in fact, it definitely wouldn't have happened, because before I got done telling my daughter I wasn't going to have one, he said, Dad, I already bought the name. So I was kind of drafted in. I love to fish. I've loved to fish since I got my first fish when I was like 3. At one point, I thought I was going to have a fly shop and do that for a living. And life has been a series of 180-degree turns. So now I paint, do printmaking, and fish. Play with my dogs.
Awesome.
My turn, I guess, huh? I think I'm going to use that, like Rick's blueprint of his introduction. First of all, I don't like talking about myself because I'm an only child. So whenever like a mic was thrust upon me or anything, I was always kind of shy. But my name's Adrian. I was born in the Philippines. I live in the highlands above Rick Harrington there. And literally the highlands, they call it up here. But I'm about 15 minutes from a couple of steelhead rivers. Love fishing all my life. Fish saltwater, freshwater. And for some reason, I was a trout fisherman, and steelhead were close by. And since I couldn't drive too far away and spend a whole day away from the family trout fishing, I decided to try my hand at steelheading, and kind of got lucky the first few times and fell in love with it. I love the ideas, the traditions of steelheading. I love the stories. I love the lore, the mystique. I spent, over a decade now trying to demystify steelhead. I still haven't figured it out, but it's just, they're fish, and they move up the river, they spawn, and they head back out to the ocean. So I try to simplify things in that way. And every once in a while, I think I have it figured out. And then, I don't know, weather system comes in and I can't figure things out. I don't even know how to put my socks on these days, left or right. So how can I figure steelhead out? But anyway, that's my story.
That's awesome. Talking about the weather, one of the things that's come up with the In the Bucket show is there seems to be a lot of folks that love to steelhead fish that are also into skiing and snowboarding. So what do these two activities have in common? Well, at the core of it, if you want to ski or snowboard in powder snow, you got to watch the weather. You want to be a successful steelheader, you'd be well advised to pay attention to the weather, because that's obviously going to affect river flow, which plus temperature is everything. Richard, I want to talk about the podcast. That's a great starting point for us. That's actually how you and I met. I was lucky enough to be a guest on your show, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. And, both you guys obviously are passionate steelheaders, and it's not just about catching fish. It seems like you're, purveyors of the culture, so to speak. And all of the stuff that surrounds steelheading, the characters, the terrain that we're fishing in, the après fishing, the social aspect of it. I think that there's a really solid mental health argument for steelhead fishing, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but I personally know a lot of people whose lives have benefited from the ability to get out on the river, and, we could get all romantic about it and talk about, the zen of it, but it's, at the end of the day, it's definitely something that people really like to do, and a lot of folks try and change their life in a way that they can do it as much as possible. So, Richard, podcasting. What was, it sounds like it's a family business, more or less. I don't know if business is the right term, but
we're trying to figure that out.
Nice.
Because we're 5 years in, and at this point, we're trying to lose money more slowly. Yeah, it's funny. As I mentioned, my daughter, Emily, is the one responsible for this going. She is, I don't want to give too much specifics. I don't want to say who she works for. She's the global communications director and more things for one of the largest law firms in the world. And she is super successful. When you watch your kids grow up, you see parts of yourself. And then you see, oh my God, if I could do that too, I'd be so much more able. And all three of my kids just amaze me all the time. But her podcast hosts are attorneys. And she said to me at Thanksgiving a few years ago, Dad, do you know when attorneys like to be in a conversation? And I said, no, honey, what? She says, when they're talking. and I said, well, I guess. And she goes, but Dad, you just like to visit with people. You like to hear them. I'm like, well, that's, to me, is just the basis of conversation, is that you got to let the other person talk. I mentioned that when we decided to do this, Adrian was my first guest because he's a good friend. We've had some great visits, but I like to visit, and I was afraid I would talk too much. So I mostly sat on my hands, and I didn't talk hardly at all, and just left him hanging there. So when I was done, I thought, well, damn, I was a really shitty host.
Well, we'll definitely talk about this at the end, but rather than make people listen to the whole show to find out if they want to leave this show and jump over to yours right now, how do they find your podcast online right now?
On pretty much every podcast venue, we're the River Rambler. And so episode 1 from about 5 years ago is Adrian. And then I think you were back on episode 3.
I believe so, with Todd Hirano, right?
Yeah. I'm scheming to have you do another thing soon. So.
Well, I didn't think you were a bad host at all. You provided beers and laughs, and that was an enjoyable time.
Well, it was funny because we used to do it in person over the dining room table, which was a pain in the ass because I had to clean the whole house to get ready to have a podcast visit. Now you can't even tell. I have crap everywhere, but all you can see is out the window behind me. And the other thing, it's funny, because of my wrecked voice, we actually get better recording through Zoom. So with Zoom, I thought the podcast was over, and my daughter just said, Dad, just use Zoom. And again, I was like, I don't know what Zoom is. And so we had to, that's not a big thing, but we had to figure that out. And we do get better recording quality. I've just met a young guy who's a recording engineer, and he's helping me figure out some remote equipment because I have some ideas of things I would like to do with it, which is going to drive my engineer son crazy because he wants pristine recording quality, and I'm more like, I want a good conversation. But I also think it's, like I know people when they're listening, like peripheral noise drives them crazy. And I grew up in a big, loud, abrasive family, and I can sit in the middle of chaos and not pay attention to it. So I realize different people have different reactions to things like that. So I guess 5 years in, you were saying you were still trying to figure it out. I'm still trying to figure it out. A friend of mine who's since stepped away, but helped start Shenango Valley Shenanigans. It was a podcast back in Pennsylvania. A bunch of warm water guys, hardcore musky guys. They love their smallmouth fishing. Really good bunch of guys. But Chad said to me, "Don't you get it?" And I said, "No." He said, "People just like to hear conversation. It's just like to eavesdrop." And I guess maybe that's true.
I got to ask. Clearly, you guys are good buddies. How did you meet?
It's got to be through the bulletin boards online, right? Spay pages.
There's Spay pages.
Yeah.
It's I suck at acronyms.
I knew this was coming.
One reason I could not function very well in the corporate world is be in a meeting and people having a conversation in acronyms, and I'd be like, "What the hell is anybody talking about?" And one day on Spay pages, I was looking at Adrian's post, and I realized his handle, it says Fishin' Asian. And I thought, no, that can't be. Cortes, that's Hispanic. That can't be. And I just couldn't leave it alone. A normal person would just say, "Oh, I don't get it." But I'm like, and so eventually I sent him a note and say, "Look, I don't mean to be a jerk," or I don't remember exactly what I said, but I essentially said, "Am I correct on this?" And he said, "Yeah." And we just laughed about it. And then it was probably 2 years later, moved to Oregon City, and I stop in my local fly shop, Royal Treatment, and get a notice that Adrian Cortes is doing an in-hand fly tying demonstration in like 3 weeks. So just based on that interaction we had online, I thought he seems like a good guy. And so I went to the demo. And if you ever get a chance to see Adrian tie in hand, do it, because there's dark arts involved. There's some kind of magic dust involved. Yeah. Feathers just
it's painful to watch. It's painful to watch.
It's phenomenal to watch. If you're a tyer, it's amazing to watch. But I waited till it was over, and I just introduced myself, and he looked at me kind of funny and said, "I thought you lived in New York." And I said, "Well, I did until 3 weeks ago." And he said, "You don't know where to fish?" I said, "I don't." And he says, "I'll show you." And we started fishing together, and we don't fish together all the time. In fact, the last couple of years, it's been not as much, but I always have a blast fishing with him. Yeah. And we're both bamboo junkies.
So, Richard, are you tying flies in hand now?
No. I keep wanting to. And quite frankly, my voice is a result of cancer 12 years ago. And outside of that, it flatlined my career. And so just as that was coming back, COVID hit. So the career side is I work a lot for somebody my age, and it keeps me from having as much time as I would like to put into tying. And I really want to tie. Adrian gifted me some of his Pearsalls, and I've got more material. I probably have way more materials than Adrian. It's embarrassing to admit. I have piles of materials, and I just haven't got around to trying it yet. Also, hand cramps.
So, Adrian, do you remember the first fly you tied in hand? Where you just kind of said, "I'm going to go for this"?
I do. Rick mentioned that we met on Spay pages, and I was on Spay pages because I got bit by the steelhead bug, so to speak. I was out at this local river, caught a few steelhead, but then I thought, the flies I'm tying, they just, they don't live up to par for the kind of fish I'm angling for. And I thought, I got to learn how to tie something pretty. And at that time, Spay pages was a means to see other people's steelhead or Atlantic salmon patterns. And there was a few tyers. Mike Papace from Ontario, and he was tying beautiful D patterns. And I believe he had a elbow injury, and so he started tying in hand. And he started tying D patterns in hand, and I was just, in awe.
Mike's a phenomenal tyer.
Yeah, and shortly after he started doing that, Jin Woo Lee joined the Spay Pages program for a bit. And then at that time, I think Jin was also starting to tie in hand. I believe he started tying with a vise, and then while he was on Spay Pages, did his first few ties in hand. And by that point, I was just enamored by what they did and why they would do such a thing. And for me, it was kind of like Steelhead. Like I mentioned, I was a trout guy, and I was not someone that wanted to steelhead, but I ended up loving it. I was a reluctant steelheader initially, and that's the same thing with tying in hand. I was a reluctant tyer in hand. I was just drawn to the challenge, and I thought, holy cow, if these guys can tie beautiful flies in hand, maybe I should try tying an ugly fly, because I already knew that steelhead eat grotesque, offerings that I toss to them. They don't really care, so I thought, well, I'd like to make something pretty. And so, yeah, the tying in hand thing, I tied a few flies in hand, and I thought, well, they'll eat that, and I thought I'd quit. But, something keeps challenging you as an angler, as a person. And that's where it started, the tying in hand part. I think that was a question. Did I answer the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm trying to understand. Were you a prolific fly tyer with a vise beforehand?
Nah, I was okay. Rick was probably better than I was, I was, it was decent, but nothing fantastic. So,
yeah, my tying has been all over the place. Because when I was a kid and was first getting obsessed with steelhead, I just wanted to catch them on classics, and I couldn't buy a fish. I hooked a few, I couldn't land a fish to save my life. And then kind of life got in the way, and I quit fishing altogether. And when I got back to it, one of the first fish I got was on a green Highlander. I got one on a skunk. And then within a few years, I was fishing string leeches. So it's...
Why do you think that was, Rick? What made you go from, Highlanders and skunks?
To be honest with you, I think painting. I started tying flies when I was probably 9 or 10. I actually was walking home from school, and not atypical of me, kind of was busy thinking about something, and I walked into my neighbor's house by mistake, thinking it was my house. And we were two big families, were in each other's houses all the time, because all the kids were about the same ages and stuff. And I walked in, and I was probably 10 steps in before I realized it was the wrong voices I was hearing. And the last thing I did before I left was I looked over and I saw an Orvis catalog. And I was already fishing obsessed. I was already trying to teach myself how to fly fish. But I'd never seen an Orvis catalog before. I'd never seen anything like it. And there was a fly on the cover. And I went home and then worked up my nerve to go back, like, next day and ask about the Orvis catalog. And that's where I saw fly tying for the first time. And so once I started, I probably kept myself out of so much trouble because I was in my room tying flies obsessively. If I wasn't doing chores or playing baseball, I was probably tying flies or drawing. And I spent a ton of time tying flies. So by the time I was 17, 18, I was really into salmon flies and all kinds of stuff. And I didn't start really get into art until about my third year of college. And I think that desire to make something, I still love to tie flies, but I use up so much of that energy painting and doing printmaking that I just don't have as much brain space left for it. But I still really enjoy it. In fact, we did the Year of the Muddler last year with the podcast, and that got me kind of juiced up on it again.
No, that makes sense because, that's what I find myself these days is the energy. Like I have to focus my energy on something. And if I'm like tying a classic pattern versus a dry fly or tying it to donate it to, some .org, the energy changes, or the passion changes. Whether I'm tying a fly for like winter dry lining, I have to really concentrate. Whereas if I'm tying a grease liner, it's just like, I could tie it on the river, but it depends on, how much energy I have in me. Other times I'll pick a fly out of my box tattered just because I don't want to tie anything. So I don't know.
Well, there's also the whole goofy phenomenon. I'm positive I'm not the only one that suffers from this. You feel like you're only going to catch a fish on the fly you just tied. So you have boxes of flies and you're like, I got to get 2 tied before I go tomorrow. And you got to tie at least, I actually think 3, because that way you can lose 2 and still be in the game. If you only have 1, you're going to lose it. That to me for years, I felt like you put jungle cock on, that fly's gone. That's a rock magnet.
Stonefly nets, nestled in the heart of the Ozarks, Ethan, a master craftsman, dedicates his skill to creating the finest wood landing nets. Stonefly nets are more than just nets. They are part of our story, each cast and every cast. Ready to make your fly fishing trips unforgettable? Visit stoneflynets.com and discover the difference of a handcrafted wood landing net. Don't let the chill keep you from your next big fish. Heated Core's Next to Skin heated base layer is your secret weapon for staying warm and comfortable during those early morning fishing trips or late season adventures. Engineered with advanced heating technology, this base layer keeps you toasty all day long, ensuring you can focus on what really matters. Gear up with the Heated Core base layer and make every cast count this season.
Now, are you tyers who have particular patterns and you just tie the same fly over and over? Are you the type of tyers that no 2 flies are the same?
No 2 flies are the same for me, Brian. The only flies I tie over and over are Hague Brown, Steelhead bees, and grease liners. I am different than most. I try to tie as strict to the recipe as possible because it challenges me. It's like the game with rules, and so I have to stay between the lines to win the game. So I try to get it as close as I can because it challenges me to focus on how many slips or how many fibers or, and just to be judicious in what I choose for the fly. But I do like to change up because I get bored. But the grease liner and the steelhead bee, they're just they're just classic dry flies. You can't beat a Lemire fly or a Hague Brown fly, and so those have to be tied as they are. So I'll keep tying those. But yeah, for classic patterns, Atlantic salmon patterns or steelhead patterns, I have to change. I have to go. If I tie, for example, a Jock Scott, then I don't want to tie like another Jock Scott. It takes too much out of me. I'll tie something else, like a Mar Lodge or something, next time around. Or if, I'll have a lot of friends, including Rick, he'll gift me hooks, and I'll see a hook. And more so these days, it's a hook. If I get a hook, I'll stare at that hook, and I'll think, what does that hook need on it? How does it need to be
I've
dressed?
got some sitting here for you right now for your winter season.
So all your tying's on irons. You're not tying on tubes or shanks ever then?
No, I haven't tied on a tube or shank in over a decade, I think. After my last sink tip steelhead, I think that was the last tube pattern I tied. Effective. I think tubes are the most effective, things at the end of a fly rod. Whether dry or whether, tied in the round, they're deadly, they're efficient, you don't bend them out. You just, switch the hooks out. But yeah, I just like the challenge. I like the hooks as well. I like the way the hooks are shaped, I think it's just more traditional. Guys like, those guys, those old icons, Lemire, Hague Brown, McMillan, they all used hooks because that's what they had. And, all the way back to Kelson, Taverner, all those dudes. So I like hooks.
So tradition's really important for you with your fishing then?
It is. It really is. Again, it's like the rules within the rules. And some traditions they're hokey. They're not, they're kind of dumb. Some of the rules that came across from the pond, and I get it. But I'll still try to play that game at times just to see if I can do it. But yeah, I don't impose the traditions on anyone else, just myself, Like if Rick's out there and if he wants to fish, T14 ahead of me, I'm just going to laugh if he snags up.
Yeah, the problem is I always think, well, Adrian goes through first because he's fishing a dry line. And then he's catching the fish. So it doesn't matter what I'm fishing. So I'm kind of done with that crap.
But Richard, it's a win-win for you because if he gets the fish, you're the gentleman who let him fish first, and that's great. You get to watch your buddy get one. And God forbid if you get one behind him, that's a pretty good story too.
Oh, that's always good. It's funny. There's such an emphasis on getting out early and just, well, first off, I hate getting up early, but when I first met Lee Spencer, I asked him when are Steelhead most active, and he looked at me kind of funny, and he said, from 9 to 3. And I said, so this whole getting up early is just to beat everybody to the water? And he said, yep. And I said, I don't care. Especially in winter, I don't, I think there's fish moving all day long if the water's up. So it's like if you're on a summer river, I think the fish tend to become more resident for at least a period of time. And so they're not so inclined to, but based on what you said before, your summer fish are moving. They're hauling.
Well, sure. Let's talk about that a little bit. So, we're up on the Skeena. We fish the lower Skeena from Tidewater up to just a little bit west of Kitwanga. So we have a very long season. We fish March and April for winter steelhead, and then we fish mid-July through the end of October for summer steelhead. Now, we like to put steelhead in these two boxes. They're either summer fish, they're winter fish. And the further you are from the ocean, the more that makes sense. But when you're on the lower Skeena, those lines get pretty blurry. So a quick example of that would be someone catches a bright fish on the Kalem in November. Sure, we'll call that a summer fish. Someone catches a very similar bright fish at the end of December. Maybe we're going to call that a winter fish. It's not a situation where those fish are coming in and spawning right away like a true winter. They're going to come in and hang out for a bit. So at the end of the day, the nice thing about the Skeena is we have these lower tributaries like the Copper and the Kalem and some other ones I'm not going to get into right now that have this crazy run timing that's literally spread out where you can get fresh fish 10 months of the year. But the behaviors change. And I'm going to talk about two things real quick. So I want to solidify my agreement with your point. Our program at the lodge is 7 o'clock breakfast, 7 o'clock dinner. The only time we would deviate ever so slightly from that is a crazy heat wave, and that's more for angler comfort. And if I've got 7 guides on the water spread out over 40 miles of river, it blows my mind how no one will catch a fish right away. None of them. But come about 9, 10 a.m., all of a sudden, fish get caught. And, the steelhead like that middle part of the day, and anybody who wants to get up in the dark and get there first, their motivation is about beating someone there, or maybe they just really like watching the sunrise on the river, and I can respect that too. But, it's from a fish activity standpoint, I love the hours. They're business hours, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the other part of it for me is that whole thing of beating people to the run. And I think, like I said, I got to fish up in your neighborhood once, and some of the rivers are massive. So it's not like you're not going to get a good run. And some of the rivers down here are not as big and are popular. And on the weekends, it's going to be hard to find a run that you want or the run that your favorite. But you can always find something, and you can always go through second. And I don't care about either one. I'm perfectly happy fishing behind somebody. I don't want to bring the motivations of the rest of life to be first, to win, to all that stuff, to my fishing. I want to fish. I like the act of fishing.
It's crazy, how some guides really ruin things. And what I mean by that is they become stressed. They're worried about what someone else is doing. They want to get there first. And then that energy transfers to the client. And then we're going to get into this because we had a good conversation on my last podcast that I recorded yesterday with Tim Arsenault and Matt Bentley about this idea of negative energy. And my point was in 30 odd years of guiding, 30 years of guiding, I have yet to see an angry person catch a fish. I've yet to see that I need a fish guy get one. His happy-go-lucky buddy will catch fish behind him in places I've never seen a fish with a fly that's, halfway tattered. So I don't know if this, we tried to rationalize it a little bit last night and say, okay, well, he's fishing the fly better, he's more confident. But I can't help but think there's some way that negative energy transfers down the line because, a happy angler is productive.
Oh, I totally agree. I don't know about Adrian. Adrian's got a whole nother thing. No. So I'll lead back to Adrian. I'll tell you something. I've had a really rough year coming to terms with having to move back east. I adore my daughters and my grandchildren. When we moved out here, I thought I was going to be able to get back 5-6 times a year to see everybody. And it just hasn't worked out that way between divorce and COVID. I just can't do it. And the one thing in my life that I knew I wanted to do is be a dad, and I'm going to go back east to be a dad. And so I'm going to be a tourist in the West again. And to come to terms with that, I had a brutally hard year. And in fact, this March, we're getting ready to go to Hawaii for my daughter's birthday. And right before I left, I went to the doctor and said, he said, what's going on? I said, I'm feeling my pulse in my cheek and in my neck. I'm afraid I'm going to have a heart attack and die in front of my kids in Hawaii. And the last thing I'll think is, what an idiot. You should have gone to the doctor, right as I die. So I got a stress test. And he says, no, you're fine. You need to figure out your stress. And so I did. But all through the winter, I couldn't buy a fish. I didn't get to fish very much anyway, but I couldn't buy a fish. And one day this spring in March, fishing on the OP with Adrian and Mark Schamberg, by the time we got down to the last run of the trip, of the week-long trip, of the day, everything else, I was a little better, but still in kind of a mood. Adrian went down with his dry line into the tail out, and I was standing right next to the boat. And I hung my D-loop on the oar. And Mark had a really frustrating day with us. We hadn't seen, touched, felt a fish where the day before a couple of friends of ours had landed 3. And he says, just give me that rod. He takes the rod from me, clears the D-loop, and gets the line all up and goes to make a cast, and he hangs it on the oar, which just sent me. If I could laugh louder, if my knees were more functional, I'd have been laying in the river laughing. And so just as I'm getting over my laughing fit, I stand up just in time for Mark to make another cast and bring my rod down right on top of my head, which made me laugh even harder. Adrian looks back upstream, and I'm just crying. I'm laughing so hard. And Mark is just disgusted and says, damn it, it's 7:00. I'm going to fish. I'm like, good, I wish you would. So he takes his rod and he goes upstream. And next thing you know, I look down, Adrian throws a beautiful cast. The sun's streaming down. It's just this glorious day. I'm on a river that I love. I'm casting better than I've cast all winter. And 12 casts in, I nail a fish. And that felt really good. And then I go back into the rest of my year. You have a glorious moment like that on the river. It doesn't change your life. You still go back home and your life is still the disaster it was before. And so I put my head down. I got a lot of work to do for the summer. I had a big show in August at the Art Center in Colorado, and I just burned myself out. And it comes around to fall, and I'm kind of back in a funk. And I hadn't hardly fished for the year, and I finally just decided, I'm fishing. I'm going to fish. I got all kinds of stuff I got to do. I don't care. I'm going to fish. So I fished a couple weeks of September, almost all of October, and couldn't buy a fish. We had one of the better returns we've had in years down here, and I couldn't buy a fish. And I'm positive it was because of my energy. And I was having a conversation with Tom Larimer, and we were talking about this same thing. And I said, the funny thing is, I feel like I'm in a better place. I think I'm coming to terms with some things and getting my head around it. I think I'm in a better place. I think I'm ready to catch fish. I caught a fish 2 hours into my next day on the water.
Awesome.
And I'm positive it's that.
It's all about those moments, eh? Fill your gas tank up for you.
Yeah.
But Adrian, whole different place. I think he lives in that place.
Well, I don't know. I'm in an anomaly, because I really do believe, just going back to, what you mentioned, Brian and Rick, about, bank hour steelheading. When you don't know much, when you start off steelheading, I guess you grab a few tidbits from people that have steelhead fished in busy rivers, and they talk about dark 30 hitting the water. And I was that guy, when I was a new steelheader. Fishing the North Umpqua, and there's certain rivers you have to be up early because of the sun. That was me back then. And that was because I didn't have a lot of steelhead under my belt. So I was like, I got to figure these fish out. And, it just, I guess, over time. And then I met Richard on the North Umpqua. He told me, like, his strategy was to wake up when he wakes up, make a cup of coffee, enjoy the morning sounds, and then head out to the water, and then he'll catch a fish, And,
Oh, I didn't say anything about catching fish.
well, so that appealed to me, right? Because we fished all our lives. I mean, I was a kid. As 7, 8 years old, I'd say, Dad, take me to whatever, the lake, the river, the pond, or the ocean. And I knew my dad wasn't like really keen on waking up that early, but I always thought, the early bird gets the worm. Anyway, that appealed to me, like waking up a little later, as I got older. And I was reading these books from like Haig Brown, Harry Lemire's, some quotes that he had, Taverner, all these Atlantic salmon fishermen and stuff like that. And a lot of them, like even Haig Brown said, and you mentioned it, Brian, like, the people like getting up early to beat the other people to the river. That's the game. That's what they won, and there's some sort of macho satisfaction in, hey, I beat Rick to the run, I get to swing through first, but I've realized too that the steelhead, they're there at 9 o'clock, at 10 o'clock, at noon. And I've had the opportunity, because I live real close, to like test these things out on the river and see if, do they take a dry fly with the sun right in their eyeballs? I guess they do, or do they take it, if a wet fly guy goes through the run first and then you follow with a dry fly, yeah, they come up and eat that as well. So I've had that opportunity. As far as having peace on the water, I think, one can be upset, angry, and it's not enjoyable. You catch a fish, you have fun, and then, you're back to that whatever is welling up inside of you. So I truly believe, like, if you're at peace on the river, it's enjoyable. You catch a fish, and you fish better if you're casting good. If you're at, you fish better, you fish more effectively, and therefore you get the fish. But I mentioned the anomaly. There was one time on the local, there was a gear angler, conventional gear angler, and he was a jig and bobber guy. And on the run that we were fishing, that I was fishing, is typically a fly fisherman portion of the river. It's shallower, but for some reason, this guy had waded out to the middle of the river and with his jig and bobber was casting to both sides of the river. And I don't think he knew any better. And I thought, okay. So, I went out there and I was just fishing my side and not saying much. I kind of waved to the fella. And then he kind of wanted my attention. So I kind of said, hey, all right, man, you're casting to both sides of the river. And then he, for some reason, I diplomatically said that he was encroaching on my side of the river, and I was fishing dry flies. But inside, I was really upset, because he basically limited what I could do, whereas he could fish the whole river now. And so I don't like confrontation. But at one point, he kept, it's jig and bobber guys. Every time they snag the bottom, they have this heavy hook set. It just stirs up the water. And I'm like, man, you're spooking all the fish now around where I'm fishing at. So I said, hey, buddy, typically don't stand in the middle of the river to fish the whole river because now I don't have any spot to really fish. He kind of got the hint, and he said he apologized. So he started casting to the other side of the river where I couldn't, hook a steelhead. And I don't know why, but I made a point to cast all the way out to where he was. It was 80 feet out. And he was standing on a rock, and I knew steelhead held behind that rock. And it was a dry fly. I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. But anyway, a steelhead rolls on it right behind the guy's rear end, and it misses. It totally misses the fly. It just rolls on it. It was dead drifting out there too. And I thought, okay, but I'm still angry on the inside. The next cast didn't land in the right spot. The third cast, I threw it out there. Perfect drift. But I saw like my tippet had like a curlicue on there that I did not like. And again, this is dead drifting. So I was like, oh, that stupid fish is going to eat this fly right now. And it's got a curlicue on my tippet. Sure enough, steelhead comes up. It was an 8-9 pound hen, bright fish, rolls on the fly, takes it down, and, tippet is all screwed up right behind this guy's butt. The fish thrashes. The guy turns around, and he goes, whoa, did you see that? And then he sees me fighting the fish, and he goes, that's your fish. And anyway, I don't say anything. I reel it in, fight the fish, land the fish, remove the fly, release the fish. And then he says, congratulations. I put my fly back on the line guide and I just storm off the river, kind of upset, I wasn't really upset. I think I was just trying to make a point to the guy. So, sometimes you can catch a steelhead when you're angry and upset, but it didn't make me feel any better. That was just a good example of my mentality at that time or for that moment. It's like, I hooked that fish, but I didn't have a good time doing it. So, but yeah, I much prefer peaceful, steelheading. 100%.
Let's talk about that for a second, because I did have this conversation with Tim Arsenault and Matt Bentley. And when you do get downholed, and I'm of the belief that at least half the time when it happens, it's just an educational thing. The person has no idea that what they're doing. And I think that goes back to especially if it's a gear guy, your typical gear guy's fishing in front of them. We take up a lot of space. We fish below ourselves. That doesn't necessarily make sense to them, right? And so then you're in this position of, okay, is this a teachable moment? And obviously, if you're smart, it's not worth getting in a confrontation on the river for a variety of reasons, not the least of which there's not really a good positive outcome that's going to be likely. But, is there a way to kill them with kindness, as my mom would say, I suppose? I liked your situation there, Adrian, though obviously your motivation wasn't necessarily to be kind, but you taught that guy something. And maybe you just a right place at the right time, or it was a knowledge bomb that you had. But yeah, I mean, that guy probably still tells that story, I bet. And hey, maybe he's a dry fly fisherman too. But Richard, when someone walks in below you, do you let it wreck your day, or do you just carry on, or what do you do if that happens?
Well, it's funny because on the water now, if you're 20 feet from me, you can't hear me. I used to be really loud. I had to use indoor voice outside. I was so loud. And that was just my natural voice. And since we haven't met in person, you don't realize how quiet I am. But that alone, I was fishing with a couple of friends of mine. We were floating, and we'd done a 3-day float, and we're almost out. And a guy walks in off the road, and he walks in like maybe 60 feet in front of me. It was on that river up in Washington, Adrian.
Oh, yes.
And Matt and Randall say, yell at the guy. And I look at him, and they're like, oh, you can't. I said, yell all you want. I can't yell. And it's actually had, that might be the only positive impact I would say to my vocal situation, in that if you take getting angry out of the equation, what's your reaction? That's what you can control, is your reaction to things. And a lot of times, on most steelhead rivers, really easy wade runs are few and far between. So do I want to get out and walk all the way down and quit fishing for 10 or 15 minutes to have a conversation with the guy? Or do I want to just let it roll off and just keep fishing? And I just keep fishing. I find the vast majority of people low homely are other fly anglers, which surprises me because I realize if you're a bobber guy, you might not realize how spay guys fish. But when another spay guy does it, I find that more irritating. But at the same time, I still yelling, getting into a confrontation, in my youth, I had a embarrassingly bad temper. I know where it lives. I don't want it out. Once you got that in you, you're jacked up for the day. I'm out there to enjoy my day, to let myself get really riled up. Doesn't solve any problem for me.
Yeah, you really end up, any confrontation, I think, you end up ruining your day because that's all that's present in your mind. And I think your question, Brian, is really, it bodes well, especially on the rivers that we fish down here south of the Canadian border. There's a lot of, the Deschutes River, it's easily accessible within a couple hours from Portland. And I've had a few, discussions with anglers, and I think I've had more than, 5 discussions with them, and all good discussions like, hey, I'm going to fish down the run, which way are you going? Are you moving upstream? Or if they're new to the two-hand casting, covering steelhead water, I sometimes will point them out where to start at the top of the run and move all the way down, and then give them some tips as well as to, the fish will hold here or there, but you want to cover each spot. So I think, just kind instruction, helps. kindness always helps in any situation, almost any situation. But yeah, there are situations too that I realize, you know what, it's just, not enough time for this, like Rick's mentioning, if it's a big hike or something, I'll just go find another spot, or I'll let them fish through and enjoy the session I have left. So there's always a reason for something. That's my focus, is like, if I get cut off, well, that's okay, because, I've had good times on the river before, and I'll have good times again. So,
well, it's funny. This makes me feel like an old curmudgeon to go down this track, but in the days of Instagram and holding your fish and all this stuff, I feel like I want to say, you're doing it wrong. It's not about, it's great. I love to catch fish, or I wouldn't be fishing. But the peace you can find out there is not from catching the fish. It's from the act of fishing. And there's a great quote in an old John Hazel video of fish good water well. I fished for, I think I was 55 before I fished with a guide, 54 before I fished with a guide. I'd fished alone. I fished in the East where it was really crowded. The ideas of etiquette I had came from old Steelhead books. And so in the East, you get low hold just constantly. And when you're fishing with guys that are center pinners, if you can fish a whole run from one rock at the top, you don't have a concept of low holding or high holding. They just go ahead and fish. And some of the rivers I had most fun on in New York, it was just constant. And if you're going to let that ruin your day, you're going to have every day fishing ruined. And I just find it easier to move on and find peace someplace else.
Growing up in Vancouver, so I grew up in Port Coquitlam. I said Vancouver, but I grew up in Port Coquitlam and, guided in South America for a year. Spent some years in the interior teaching skiing, and then moved to Whistler for 12 or 14 years, and then Squamish. So moved around, but more or less living in the same general area. So the two rivers that people fish the most there would be the Vedder and the Squamish. Now, the Squamish has all wild fish, doesn't have nearly as many fish. A broad, shallow river, lends itself really well to fly fishing. There's some fantastic gear anglers there. Some guys throw spoons, some short floaters. But, high percentage of fly anglers. But lots of space, not that many fish. Honestly, a fantastic experience. The Vedder has a lot more fish. It's a hatchery there. And a lot more anglers, a lot more gear anglers. And one of the things I always found really interesting, and I don't know if you guys get this south of the border, is when the gear anglers are lumped up in a high concentration, a lot of them in a small area, they just kind of come up with a system where they kind of take turns casting, so they can all fish the same water, but the one guy throws it up and the other guy throws it up, so their floats are all going along one after another, but they don't tangle. And so they kind of figure it out. And then along comes one of us with our goofy fly rods, and we think we need 200 feet of river to operate. We just kind of screw up the whole system. So we end up seeking out different water. And, thinking about dry fly fishing, Adrian, because we haven't talked enough about it yet. We got to do that before the show's over.
Never.
Is, a good dry fly angler recognizes the part of the river that works well for them. And, oh, by the way, it doesn't work that great for us sink tip people. It doesn't work that great for people, fishing heavy spoons or float fishing. Your zone is the shallow stuff that, works really well for dry fly fishing. And by the way, the fish, steelhead, that's where they love to be. We see this on the Skeena, by the way. I pick people up from the airport. I've got a little shtick I usually do to set them up for success. One of the pearls of wisdom, I'll call it, I give them is wade shallow, cast short. There's a bunch of other stuff in there, but wade shallow, cast short. It's a huge river, but you'd be surprised. We catch fish in 2.5 feet of water routinely.
Is that because your travel lanes are closer in?
Okay, sure. That they're moving fish, and I think there's a variety of reasons they like the shallow stuff. Avoiding the seals is probably one. I think the short answer, Richard, is because they're not that affected by people yet. I think anglers push the fish out. I think without people standing in the river, they like to run the bank, and they like to hang out in that shallow water. And if the water's cold, I kind of think they're like Alaskan rainbows, where they like to sun themselves a little bit.
It's funny. Up winter fishing, we found fish in really shallow areas. And then my buddy Terry Rogers and I used to do, before we got closed out by a fire, because there's so much dangerous timber now, we used to do a red survey up on the headwaters of a local stream. And I think ours our third survey, our third pass through the stretch in May before we actually saw fish. And it was probably close to a 10-pound buck. And it was in 12 to 14 inches of the water with its dorsal fin out in a little patch of sunlight. And I'm because it is icy cold water. I'm sure it was sunning itself.
I love the way you guys, when you're talking about your rivers, you're not name dropping, you're calling them the local river.
Well, Adrian and I have a local favorite that we would like to have remain anonymous forever.
Nice.
You know, it's funny. I suspect that's why my daughter named ours the Rambler, because my daughter's the one that came up with it. And I said, I'm not going to call it the stinking River Rambler.
It's a great name.
Have you read The River Why?
I don't know if I have. I don't believe I have.
The main character's father is like a fishing celebrity in the 60s, I think, maybe 70s. And he's just a blowhard. And to me, that would be the River Rambler. And that's the last thing I want to be, is some guy who thinks he's an expert on everything.
I got a good nickname for you now, the Blowhard.
Oh, thanks. Don't start going to nicknames, or I'll come up with something good for you.
I deserve it.
See, now I'm off topic. What was I going to tell you about? I forgot. See,
it was about shallow steelhead. I don't know. Maybe that wasn't it. That was a segue.
I don't know. I will jump backwards to another topic. We were talking about fly tying, and I've kind of run the gamut all over the place. And I hated the muddler minnow to like nobody's business for years. I just hated that fly. When I was a kid, I got really into them, and I couldn't buy a fish on one. I fished them every way you could think. I fished them as dries. I fished them with split shot. This is before I even heard of sink tips. I could not buy a fly. And again, when I met Lee Spencer, he told me that down on, and Adrian already brought it up, so I'll say North Umpqua, but also because that river is special. Lee Spencer told me that those fish will come up through 30 feet of black water to hit a skater. And I said, what do you skate? And he said, a muddler. And I was like, I don't have any muddlers. And I dug through my box. I had one muddler left over from my muddler binge. And he hitched behind the head. And so I hitched behind the head. And about 3 hours later, I got my first North Umpqua fish in water so deep, if I had fallen in, I'd have drowned. It was dark, 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 deep. And I watched this big nose come up and sit my skating muddler down through a bunch of cutthroat. And that's the only fish I've caught on that river has been on skating muddlers. I've since changed the way I tie muddlers to skate. But then getting a look actually at Al Perryman's Instagram account, and then getting a look at his fly boxes. Al doesn't tie patterns. He just ties flies that he feels like tying. And it has in common with what I like is kind of a teardrop shape. If it's a skater, all I care about is a wake. And if it's a wet fly, all I care about is some movement. And I want a teardrop shape. And I tie 3 of everything because I think my third one is usually my best one. And then I change because I can't stand to sit and tie the same thing over and over again. I cannot do production work. My mind will go away from me. But it's, Adrian, that was it 2 years ago on the Eastern River that, you changed flies every fish. And you caught a lot of fish.
Yeah. No, yeah, it was, I just wanted to see what fish would come up to, and I have one rod, that, Rick knows well. Her name is Becky. It's a James Reed, 11 foot 5 inch 6 weight. And she's the sweetheart. So she only fishes a steelhead bee. And so I'll usually start with her on the, summer steelhead rivers. But, like Rick mentioned, you can't, keep tying the same fly. Well, I mean, I can only fish a steelhead bee for so long before I want to fish something else. So I ask Becky, hey, can I go fish the other rod? So I'll go grab the other rod, and that rod doesn't care what I put on that rod. The rod has no name. It's another James Reed summer run rod. So I put whatever I want to. So that's kind of like, so there's Rick's muddler that he ties. I call it the Rambler muddler. And I'll fish that on there. I'll fish other patterns. And so when we were on this river, I caught a few on the steelhead bee, and I thought, man, let's change it up. So then I started, every time I caught a fish, I'd retire fly, which I typically do, just to remember the moment. And plus, sometimes the hook gets bent out of shape. So, yeah, I just put more patterns on there, or different patterns. So that's always fun. But yeah, it's I think it's effective too to kind of switch out flies. So especially if you're fishing the same pool, so whatever, if there's a pot of steelhead, at least they see a different offering next time coming through. So
I think Adrian mentioned that, but I think it's actually a really interesting tradition that, as effective a fisherman as Adrian is, he has a whole pile of flies that he's retired and with a tag on them that notes the fish and the date, don't you?
Oh yeah, I do, because I'm forgetful. I'm like very forgetful. I want to.
There's more to it than that.
There is. I think too is I want to remember the moment. I think each steelhead is special. It's funny. I want to elevate the steelhead more than it is. I mean, a steelhead, a sculpin is just as important as a steelhead. Is just as important as a mayfly. Is just as important as a river structure. I mean, it's all, one big connected system. But I really do love steelhead. And so if I do catch a steelhead, I want to memorialize it, to remember that moment. And that's why I kind of, tag those flies and retire them. Because then, one day I might not be able to remember these stories, but I can look up at that fly on the wall with a tag and think, oh yeah, I caught that fly right there, the Rambler Muddler. We were on that eastern river in the evening, and I couldn't see it. I couldn't see the fly anymore because it was so dark. So I gave a location twitch where I stripped the line in, and the fly burped up to the surface, and the steelhead was on. And so I want to remember those moments. So yeah, I have a whole pile of flies on the wall. Well, a whole pile of flies, not even on the wall yet, that I need to tag before I forget the stories. And it makes steelheading special for me,
So Adrian, how did you connect with James? James is obviously a legend in the bamboo rod building. James is someone I've known for a while. When I used to put on my cast and blast events in Squamish, James was a big supporter of that. So James, if you're listening, thanks, buddy. One day maybe we'll manage to get James on the show, but there's no question he's definitely one of the best and most innovative bamboo rod builders around. How did you guys connect? He's up here in Campbell River.
I know, it's kind of funny. I was, again, on Spay Pages tying in hand, and, I had, some decent rods, graphite rods, but I thought to myself, one day if I ever could afford a bamboo rod, I'd get a Bob Clay, or something like that. And around that time, I was actually on the phone a few times with Bob Miser, because I thought, I'm going to get a Miser rod. And I had talked on the phone with Bob a few times about what I wanted. But in the back of my head, I thought someday I'm going to get a bamboo rod. And, Spay Pages has the classified ads section. And a fella posted on there that he had a James Reed rod that was a 12-foot 7-weight summer run. And it was a used price, but it was amazingly affordable. This was before James, before everyone knew about James, And so I thought, oh, I got to get this rod. So anyway, I asked my wife permission, like a good husband should. My thing to her was like, hey, this is the last rod I'm ever going to get. I want a bamboo rod. This is the last rod I'm ever going to get. She holds that phrase over my head, I think, until the day that I die, because I have 4 James Reed rods now. And so I don't know. But that's how and James was on Spay Pages, pretty active at that time as well. And I think we met for the first time. I believe he came down and had a grassroots bamboo clave on the Sandy.
Yeah, that's where I met Obachowski. And
Rick was there, Schamberg was there.
Met Shammy there.
Yeah, and so I believe that's the first time I met James in person. But, as a great builder is, he connects with the people, his clients, and, we just became buddies. We fished, a few times together. I wish I could fish with him more often. And maybe hopefully someday we'll walk around near the Campbell River just to look at old Roderick Haig Brown stomping grounds and chat with James a bit. So that's how we met. And I really do love his rods. Not only are they beautiful, but they cast wonderful. And they're fish fighting machines as well. So yeah, it makes time on the water more enjoyable for me. And Rick's got a few of his rods as well.
Yeah. It's funny. I ran a fly shop when I was 19, and my first rod, I just redid my first rod. My uncle gave me a Horrocks Ibbenson Governor when I was probably 5 that he bought for my mom in probably 38 or 39. And my mom, was a little tiny kid, and he was so excited to have a little person to fish with, and my mom didn't take to it. So he fished it for a while and then just put it away. And when I came along, I got my first fish with him, and all I could think about was fishing with him because nobody else in my family fishes or is interested in the outdoors, really. And so every time we'd go visit, I'd fish, and he just ended up giving me the rod. So that was the only fly rod I had until I started working just before I started working in the Orvis shop. I bought a blank from a guy, but I was working in an Orvis shop just as graphite came along. And so the original Orvis graphite with the spiral wrap still on it, that was the hot rod, which is really funny because I thought those things were just so blisteringly fast. And I still have one that just feels like a wet noodle now. But when I was at this fly shop, there was no internet. So people would come in, they had these rods they wanted to sell. And I'd say, well, you can put an ad in the paper, but if you don't get any luck, the shop doesn't buy rods, but if there's something I like, I'll buy it. And so for like $50 a piece, I had a pretty nice collection of rods, but I got around to my last year of college and I was out of money. And I sold the rods. Actually, as a brilliant investment guy, I sold them for what I paid for them to my friends. And I still remembered having a few that I really liked. And so I'd just gotten back to a point where I was thinking about getting into collecting bamboo rods when I got a chance to try spey casting finally. And I was completely obsessed with spey casting. And real good fortune of meeting Bob Miser and getting my very first spey rod was a Miser 6126 that I still love to this day. And then when I was sick, about the same time I was sick, James posted on spey pages his build process. And then he had a couple of videos. And I'm sitting home, feeling like there's a good chance I'm not going to survive this. And for some reason, I got obsessed on getting one of his rods. And through kind of a comedy of communication, convinced him to let me pay for the rod up front, which is not something you do. You make a deposit and then you pay when you come up in the build schedule. And in the meantime, my ex-wife got a job out west, and we moved back just in time for James to have the little clave gathering down in Sandy. And Adrian and I met Chris Obachowski, who's a good friend of ours, who's also a builder, not on the scale that James is, because Chris is a doctor, and so is a part-time builder. But met Schamberg there, who builds glorious rods and machines, amazing reels. And I actually got to pick out a rod in person. And then there was the Sandy clave was still going on. And so then James came down for that one year. And so I was obsessing over this rod. And I finally said, okay, this is the one I want. This is the one I want. And he said, yeah, but I'm going to make yours 2 inches longer and 5% softer in the butt. And you're going to like it even more. And I was like, awesome. And he was right. I do. It came, I think it arrived about a year later, and it is amazing. And then the mistake I made at that first get together, he said, is there anything else you want to cast? And I was like, well, I can't afford this one. What am I going to do buying the second one? But I cast a second one. Of course I wanted a second one. So I have two. The first one, I said to my ex, look, I don't even know why I'm thinking this, but I'd really like to order one of these rods. Do you care? And she goes, where are you going to get the money for? And I said, well, all my first illustration jobs were for fishing magazines and fishing books, and I still have portfolios of all these. So I went onto the Drake message board, and I sold through the classifieds about 40 old illustrations, really cheap, just so I'd have enough money to buy a rod. So there's a bunch of guys off the Drake message board that are friends of mine now that have a bunch of old pencil drawings that financed my first James Reed rod.
That's funny. That's great.
So it sounds like, you guys have both at times been pretty active on message boards, the Drake, spey pages. Is that still a big part of your life?
I haven't been on the Drake in ages. I still, Adrian is the main entertainment on Spay Pages.
I was just about to say I'm hardly on Spay Pages as much as I used to be.
Yeah, but you do really good. You do really thoughtful posts.
Well, I think for me, Spay Pages, it really kind of changed my life learning how to tie flies. It's surprising the trajectory of my life. Again, I was a trout guy. I was into like tying a perfect pheasant tail nymph and all that stuff. And now I really enjoy steelheading. So I like to reconnect with the guys that are still on Spay Pages. And part of it too is I work night shift, Brian, in the hospital. I'm an RN. I work in a cardiac unit, and a lot of the downtime, like 2, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, I have to stay awake somewhat, without drinking too much caffeine. So I'll pop in on the Spay Pages and use that time to stay awake, and I hope my boss isn't listening to this podcast. No, she'd be okay with it. But yeah, and a lot of that is, and then just sharing information about tying flies because, to be honest, I think tying, it's like geekdom, I mean, there's just a bunch of tying geeks. You can't really share with the normal population. Like if I go to the grocery store and talk about fly tying, you're on a park bench. It's, if you meet someone, they're like, oh, you like fishing. And they're going to talk to you about their uncle who, fished for, I don't know, whatever, trout in a pond, and no one can talk about fly tying. So I think like the message boards, it allows people, like-minded people, to share some ideas or give some tips or get inspired. And that's what I like, inspiration. Because people inspired me, so I like to share, what might inspire others, hopefully. So yeah, it's part of my life, I think.
It's funny. Again, not knowing what a podcast was, I didn't know what a message board was. I went on the Drake website. I started buying the Drake magazine when I first came out at a magazine stand, and I went to renew because I hadn't seen it for a while. I went online and I saw message board and I clicked, and it was obscene, completely ungoverned, out of control, rude, hysterically funny. There were some just outrageously funny people on there. And there was a guy that was a guide in Montana who went by Outcast, he was the most aggressive gatekeeper of a message board you can ever imagine. And if you were going to come on there and talk about, that was the classic joke on the Drake was, what's your favorite 5-weight? Everybody was going to come on and just destroy you because nobody wanted to talk about that. They wanted to talk about the better parts of fishing, not being a gear hound. And I just read it. I was too intimidated even to post because you had to do this whole entry thing. And one day, like 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm up clicking away, trying to figure out how to post this movie as my intro. And I can't figure out how. I can't figure out how to load it up. And I get a message from this guy who's a guide in Montana, who's this aggressive gatekeeper, and he talks me through how to do it. So I keep thinking this guy's a jerk. And he turns out he's super helpful, really nice guy. We got to the point where we were messaging fairly frequently. And I've been self-employed for 35 years. I don't get to see that many people. It's actually kind of fun to go online and check out. And when you get to meet people that you've known online, sometimes it works out to be really good friendships. For my 50th birthday, my kids for Father's Day gave me a rape whistle because I was fishing with people I met on the internet, and it was driving them crazy. They still mock me for it. And I have some dear close friends that I met. I met Adrian on the internet. I mean, I met Mike Pappas and Dan LaForme that are mainstays on Spay Pages at Poppy's Clave this fall. Just great guys. My ex used to kind of mock me that she'd say, I could drop you any place in the world. You'd have friends in 15 minutes. And I never thought that was a thing. I'm good at meeting people. And I used to tease her. I'd say, I really suck at foreign language. It would take me 45 minutes. But some of the most fun I've had in my life was in a pub in Scotland where I could hardly understand anyone, just because I enjoy people. I don't want to fish with all of them, because I like to fish with like 1 or 2 people. But
Is that your motivation with the podcast, Richard?
the thing to me, I mentioned to you before we started, there's a great quote in a James Lee Burke book that I will trash, but I won't get it right. But it's essentially everybody has a story. Not everybody is comfortable telling their story, but when the basis of your conversation is your mutual love for swinging flies for steelhead, you can usually kind of find out at least the fishing part of their story. And I think I find that fascinating. I mean, I think this is arguably the hardest way to catch fish, catch steelhead. I think to get to the point where you cast well enough, to where you learn where fish live well enough, especially with populations thinning out, why is that the appeal? And I think that leads to a group of people that are fun to visit with. So it's people's stories. That's why I've had people on the first year we had, Callie Prater Freeman and Shandy Danford came on with Nick Wheeler and Josh Lynn talking about both Callie and Shandy's first steelhead. They were just beginning. Josh and Nick both guide, and they got them on their first fish. They coached them through their first beginning to cast. And I find that as interesting as people who are like big names in the fishing industry. For me, it's the love of rivers. My love of steelhead probably has to do with my love of the Northwest and the impact my uncle had on me that got me started fishing. But for other people, they have different reasons. And I like finding them all out. And then there's the whole conservation thing.
Yeah. And I think, for myself with the podcast, what I hope happens is exactly, I think what we've done today is we've given people some knowledge and we've told some stories and hopefully inspired people to try some new stuff, whether it's tying a fly in hand, which is pretty extreme. We can all agree. You want to talk about making something hard, that's pretty about as far as you can take it. But at the end of the day, fishing isn't about reeling a fish in. Fishing is about anticipation. Fishing is about a shared human experience. I'm quoting my good buddy Feet Banks in the Bucket, episode number 2. Feet Banks is yet to catch a steelhead. Feet, if you're listening, buddy, it's this could be the year, but the guy loves to fish. And that's what it's all about, is just, I think, everything that goes around it. And to me, what's missing a little bit in my life, and I've said this before, is I haven't tied a fly in a decade. I feel like I'm confessing something here. It's probably maybe 2 decades. I don't have a good excuse. Fly tying used to be a big part of my life.
Well, you do have a good excuse. How many kids do you have and what are their ages?
I've got 4 kids, 2 through 8.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's busy.
You don't have any free time.
Yeah.
And a new wolfhound.
and a new wolfhound. But, it's not an excuse because we got fly tying desks at the lodge. But here's what I'm missing is when you sit down and you tie flies, you kind of fall in love with what you're tying and then you picture yourself using that fly. And you brought it up earlier, I think, Richard, about the best fly you have is the one you just tied. And that's what I'm missing right now. I've got lots of friends who are great tiers. I'm not wanting for flies. People give me flies all the time. And I love those flies. They're better than what I could tie. But I'm missing the part where I sit down for an hour and build it myself. I think that's going to come as my kids get a little older. But right now, my cop-out excuse is the mess. I'm a messy fly tyer. If I sit down and tie one fly, I'm going to destroy the whole room. There's going to be marabou spreading throughout the house.
Yeah. I'm literally right now where I'm sitting at, because I had to move into this room. I'm sitting on a bunch of fly tying crap right now, like literally. If I turn around, I've got, like packages I'm sitting on.
Well, it's funny because I still do one art festival a year, one street festival up in Colorado. That's just one of my closest friends lives there, and the show's been really good to me. The town's been really good to me, and I love being there. And so I still go. But I used to do, for years, I did like 18 all over the country. And it's funny, if you're sitting at an art festival, I've never actually been, I'm assuming you probably at some point went to promote the lodge to fly fishing festivals.
No. But I've done my fair share of fishing shows before we had the lodge, but.
So I've never been to one of those. And part of the reason is, I hated doing art festivals. It's the very first one I did, and I've done them for decades. I would be much happier painting if I never showed my work to anybody and I just painted. But at art festivals, probably half the conversations I have, which I hear other artists complain about all the time. And I'm sitting there bored in an art festival. So I'm happy to talk about painting, but I end up visiting with people who are wanting to learn how to paint. Everything from young people to my favorite people I've ever visited with in my life are twin brother and sister out in Denver. And they would never hear this. So, and I don't want to get that personal with them, but we've had epic conversations about color, about abstract expressionism, about all kinds of stuff. But the thing, and they're both really frustrated because in their mid-20s now. He has a couple of kids. They're both working really hard. And I said, but the thing is, making your living about it is not what it's about. The act of painting is what it's about. And if you get focused on, you got to get a painting finished. And I got to focus on that in order to make a living. But when my painting fell apart when I was sick, my mind kind of left me and I painted like crap. But I'm so stressed out about being sick, about making a living and everything else. I still painted all day. And I'd go into my oncologist and he'd say, I don't get it. I know you're concerned about living and you're concerned about your career and you're concerned about all of this. How do you have the pulse rate of a Galapagos tortoise and your blood pressure is like in the sink? And I said, Doc, I paint like shit, but I still paint all day. It's the act of painting is the value to the painter. Yes, I make a living doing it, but it's the act of painting that is what makes me peaceful. And that fishing, casting, wading, and tying, to me, they're all the same. You're mentally absorbed in something that is taking your full concentration. And to me, because of the way I'm wired, one of my hardest things is settling on focus. And fishing especially does it for me because I have so much, the wind, my buddies that I striper fish with, the weather would be going in the toilet. They'd say, let's go get a beer. I'm like, no, it's just getting fun. And I finally realized that's when I can really focus, when I'm getting blown all over the place. Adrian and I just had amazing day. I don't know, that was maybe the first year of COVID. I got that fish on the hail on our local.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite fish ever.
Yeah.
That at the last minute, Adrian settled into his perfect rock chair with a beer. And at the last minute, I thought, maybe I should put my raincoat on. And within about 10 minutes, I hooked a fish just as it started hailing so hard. It was unbelievable. And Adrian tailed it for me. And it was just a cluster. And it was I'll remember that moment forever because there was so much going on. And you're in that moment that's so absorbing.
And, it was funny. It was like one of those moments that I also will remember because we showed up at the river, 9:30, 10 o'clock. And the pool that I wanted to take him, you had to wade across another pool above that section. And it was raining. And I was a little concerned because this is before he had his knee surgery that could we cross that tail out and then come back, with water rising.
It was kind of dicey crossing too.
Yeah. And I thought, and then once we got there, there were two guys that were already fishing that hole. And I thought, well, what are we going to do? Pout, go find another pool or just, try to wade the river. And we did. We crossed the river and, we took our time and we did just fine, rested, walked down to that pool and there was no one there and you hooked that fish. So it was a great moment.
And I'm pretty sure we waited out those two guys because we didn't want them to know you can cross.
Right. Yeah. We had to wait a bit. Yeah.
Because it's depending on the water level, it's a little bit of a dicey wade and it's above not good stuff to go into.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Richard, I wanted to ask you about the art. Does fly fishing influence your art, your painting?
Yes, but not in the way you'd think. My buddy James Samsel is a phenomenal painter. He's a plein air painter. Plein air is painting on location. And he's finally quit harassing me about going and doing it with him because I did that for several years and I hate it with a red hot passion. I thought that's what you did to be an artist and you had to go on location and paint your landscape. And like I said, I'd never intended to do what I'm doing for a living. I was a freelance illustrator and the internet launched and I was out of business so fast. I didn't know what was happening. I made it a decent living. I wasn't getting rich, but this is like 35 years ago. I was making $65,000, $70,000 a year, and I was taking 12 or 14 weeks a year off. And I just loved my life. And the internet launched and put me out of business. And I have 3 kids, and I had bills to pay and college to help with, and had no idea how to do it. Because at the time I was 36 or 7, and the reason I was a freelance illustrator is I just wanted to be either home or in wilderness. And I painted on the side from being in wilderness. That's what I love doing, is paint landscape. And painting has gone all over the place, trying to make a living and just what my own interest in painting is. And then getting sick messed up my approach to painting. And I'm still trying to figure that out again. But when it comes to landscape, I find landscape when I'm out. So I find landscape when I'm walking my dogs. It used to be a lot when I was paddling, running rivers, and when I'm fishing. And the year I got sick, I refer to as the year of too much good luck, because I won the trip to Wally's Lodge, to Spey Lodge. And of all things, my friend Bob White sent me an email out of the blue. And he says, "Do you know how I was artist in residence at Bristol Bay Lodge last year?" I said, "Yeah." And I'd actually said to my ex that when he did a report about being an artist in residence, I said, "I just don't know how that happens. I don't know how you make that happen." And she goes, "Well, you got to figure it out." I'm like, "I don't even know how to ask about it." And I get an email from Bob. He says, "Want to be artist in residence at Bristol Bay Lodge?" And I'm like, "What?" He says, "Do you want to be artist in residence at Bristol Bay Lodge?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And I said, "But there's a problem." I said, "What?" Because I'm not a sporting artist. I don't paint. I mean, there's a whole tradition of sporting art. Bob is probably, at this point, maybe the most well-known. He's done the covers of John Kerouac's books for years and illustrated his column for years. And he's guided in Alaska for decades and just has a great following. He's a wonderful painter. C.D. Clarke is another contemporary that kind of follows in the footsteps of Chet Renison and Ogden Pleisner. Frank Benson was earlier. But I thought at one point that's what I was going to do. And my love of painting took me much more contemporary. And at this point, I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with it. I had been painting. If you go to my website, richardcharrington.com, there's an initial C in the middle there. Under landscape, you'll see where my real passion is. It's large format landscape work. It's like 10 or 12 feet wide. And I just did a show of that this summer out in Colorado because I'm trying to get back to it. But for the longest time, I couldn't paint that anymore. And I've been trying to get back to it. I've been painting some smaller landscape. And somebody said, "How come there's never fishermen in your paintings?" And I always say, "When was the last time you got to a run and you said, 'Oh, good, there's somebody in it'?" So what I told Bob is I'm a landscape painter, not a sporting artist. And Bob said, to my benefit, Bob said, "I don't care. We don't care. We just want you to come and see what we'll do." And so I got up there and I said, "The problem is I love to fish. I might just come and fish the whole week." He goes, "That's fine." So I got to go to Bristol Bay Lodge, a place I can't begin to afford to go to. And I had a wonderful week with some great guys. I got to be there with Bob, with C.D. Clarke, and with Jeff Kennedy. We had a blast together. Jeff and C.D. and Bob all do plein air painting. And I'm fishing, and all of a sudden I turned to a guide and I said, can you take me over there? And Chris and Jeff were just hammering char, and I caught about 3 char, and I was kind of bored with it, and said, "Can you take me over there?" And he goes, "Well, we don't go over there. There's no fish over there." I said, "No, I want to go over there and look back at this angle. I think I want to do a drawing." And so what I do, what my work has evolved to, is I do sketches when I'm out, and then I paint from those. And what I'm looking for is more abstract shapes in the land, where plein air painters tend to go to a place and figure out how to make a painting out of it. When I'm at a place long enough, eventually I see something that makes me subconsciously find shapes in the landscapes that I feel like make an interesting painting. And so it has more to do with, to be honest with you, I think it's how we navigated before There's map and compass and GPS. You remembered landform. And so I go from that to my more contemporary thoughts on art about how you design an interesting painting. And if you combine those two things together, I find paintings when I'm outside. I don't go outside and set up and do a painting. So it influences my work a lot, but not necessarily the way people would think. I just shipped a painting yesterday that's 15 feet wide, 4 feet tall and 15 feet wide.
I got to jump in and ask, how do you ship something like that?
Well, that painting's on 3 panels. I spent a day boxing it up, and then I use an art shipper. I use iTransport, which is all they do is ship art, and they are way more expensive than shipping FedEx. But 2 years ago, I got a call from Summit Gallery in Park City where I show, and they said, can you repair a painting? And I said, yeah, I can repair it depending on what's happened. And he said, well, we sold one of your pieces to a couple down in Texas, and he was damaged in shipment. And I said, well, how is it damaged? And they said, well, we'll have to send you a picture. They'd paid to have it crated. And the only thing I can think of is someplace along the way, a semi-rig ran over it because the crate was impressed into the painting. And they said, no, that painting needs to be burned. That painting is not fixable. There's conservators at the museum, the National Museum of Art cannot save that painting. That painting is destroyed. So I ended up, something I would say I can't do. They asked me if I could do it over again. It was kind of funny in the middle of COVID. I couldn't even get stretcher bars the same size, so I had to do a slightly larger painting. I cannot repeat paintings. I think the second one I did was actually better than the original. But I have since, I only use iTransport because all they transport is art. And I've had great luck with them. And it took me years to find them. I used to box stuff up. I used to create stuff myself and ship it. And with more traditional transport. But once paintings get big, you need to use an art shipper.
You know, you mentioned that painting, the second go at it, you thought it was better than the original. Because my only perspective is from fly tying. So, you know, the flies that I tie from before, they're not as good as the flies I tie now just because I've learned technique. From the art, perspective in art from your end, is it just because you didn't have the same emotion, passion, as far as reproductive work or?
The same reason I can't tie more than 3 of a fly. I don't want to repeat a painting because when I paint, I do a small study. And then I'll do a medium-sized piece, like 30 by 40. And if I feel that works, then I'll do a big version of it. And each step along that path of 1, 2, 3, there's 2 parts to it. One, I don't want to make the larger one have more detail in it. I want to make all the marks bigger. And to me, that's just my interest in painting. I think the painting itself, the surface of the paint, the way the color and texture and values work is more interesting if you don't add detail, you add bigger mark making, which I hate even talking like that because it sounds like I'm a professor and I have a very limited art education background. I mostly learned to paint by looking at work that I loved in museums and a few books and painting my ass off. When I first started doing art festivals, I was desperately broke. I drove to Florida with a van load of the family van with the seats pulled out, full of paintings and my booth without enough money to get home, without enough money to pay my rent that month. And, I couldn't believe I could sell a painting. I thought the only people that were going to be interested in buying paintings was like old people. And if I didn't sell a bunch of paintings in the next 5 years, all the people that are interested in painting were going to be dead and gone. And I was never going to make a living. And at this show in Naples, Florida, this young family pushing a stroller walked in and bought 3 paintings. And I was just floored. And as they left, this woman said, "Oh, I'm so upset. They bought the painting I wanted." And I said, "Well, that's one of a series of, can you watch my booth for me?" And she said, "What?" And I said, "Well, I have the last one of that series in my van. I'll go get it." So she watched my booth for me. I ran over to the van As I open the back of the van, I hear a honk, and I look up, and it's the family that bought 3 paintings waving at me as they drive by. I go back and I sell this woman the 4th in the series that they bought. As she leaves, the husband from the family comes back and says, "We liked him so much, we want that one too." And I called my then wife and said, "We're okay. We're okay this month." And then I had several more shows in Florida, and I made money. And I at that point, I think I'd sold maybe 5 paintings in my whole life. And I sold on that trip to Florida, I sold 26 paintings or something. And at this point, I've sold somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,200 paintings. I still don't know why anybody buys paintings. I don't know why anybody listens to podcasts. My father got real upset with me a few years ago and said, "You don't even have a plan." And I said, "Dad, I had 14 plans and they all tanked. The internet put me out of business." And I pointed out to him, he got transferred all over the country. He went where his job took him. And I was a divorced father. I wasn't going to leave my kids. So I lived in Western New York and I had to stay there. And I didn't have any skills that I could make a living with. And so that's what led me to painting. And I was shocked that it worked. And it wasn't until I was 50 and I was on the verge of being done paying college tuition that I felt like I had the freedom to really start pushing what I was doing with my work and try to make it something more about what I wanted it to be. And just as I felt like I was really getting dialed in is when I got sick and it all kind of fell apart. So now I'm back at my age trying to figure it out again and hoping to have another 30-year run. We'll see.
Pretty amazing to be able to make a living creating something, right? And to find out that there's an audience it's got to be very satisfying.
You know, I mentioned that the value of art to the artist is the act of making. I think painting can be close to athletics. It can be where your mind and your body are completely focused. And that's when I paint best. When I paint best, I'm completely focused and I'm moving and you're making interesting marks. And as soon as I'm worried about whether somebody's going to like it, I start being really careful. And that to me leads to boring painting. James Reed and I were chatting the other day on text, and he doesn't use the Morgan hand mill very often, which most of the guys I know that build are using a Morgan hand mill. And I sent him a note and said, "Oh, I thought you'd use that." And he said, "No, it'd be like you painting with a broom." And I said, "Oh, I've painted with brooms before, but mostly right now I paint with either wadded up rags or pieces of broken insulation foam." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, I like using ink brayers too, like a roller." And he goes, "You don't use brushes?" And I said, "Not very much, because I don't want perfect paint. When I'm outside, the thing I love about being outside is realizing that you're in the middle of chaos, that all of life is going on around you. And I want the surface of my painting to reflect that. And so if I'm busy trying to make a perfect painting, there's no chaos in it. So I want the surface of my paint to be as chaotic as the natural world is. And I want those layers of chaos to build up and bring you the representational image. So I guess at some point that started with you asking me about how it applies to fly tying. My fly tying is a little bit the same way. Is what I'm looking for is that teardrop shape, and whatever kind of materials I want to combine is where the creativity part comes in for me. So I go back and forth with this year. I was kind of obsessed with what I know a lot of people refer to as guide flies that are really simple flies. But for me, it was almost a challenge of how spare can a fly be and still be an effective fishing tool.
No, I think that that bodes well for each and every person. There's a challenge, like in your art. You said the value of the art is in the
act of making it.
Yeah, and I kind of feel that way with steelheading, with fly tying. There is value in steelhead. They're wonderful fish, but how we hook them or how we catch them, there's this process, and it's just sitting down, tying, and thinking about the fish, and then getting that fly, whatever material you want to put on it, whether you want to limit it to 3 items, or you want to put a full dress on, and then, translating that into the river for a specific run, for a specific time of day, and then when you hook that fish, the value is in the act, that anticipation that you're projecting something, onto that hook, or you're projecting something onto your canvas, from what's going on in your head. And I think that's what makes it special.
When I would argue it's that level of concentration throughout that, through the tying, through learning where steelhead hold in a run, in a river, learning to cast, learning to spay cast, learning where you have your anchor based on the wind, learning how you adjust your rod angle depending on how deep you're wading, all of that. It's a level of concentration. That's people all the time will say, I don't really remember, where my day went. It's because you were concentrating so much in that moment. I mean, it sounds corny now in this day and age to say, but it's a level of meditation that I think brings you peace. And that's what I wish people would understand. Like a piece of the ecosystem, I value steelhead as much as I value, actually probably more than I value almost anything else. I love steelhead. Like I love bears and dogs and a few other things. But all the things in my life that I have loved doing, from being a father to painting, to tying flies, to fishing, to running rivers, all require a level of concentration that you are so caught up in the moment that it brings you peace.
Yeah, I agree.
And I wish people would quit concentrating on, I got to catch a fish.
Yeah, it's funny. I went fishing for the first time this year yesterday. I thought, I got to get out on the water. And, we've all fished thousands of hours, but, I usually take a break during, December, just for the holidays for family. And then I start up again, January. But during that month of just, family, all the hubbub, traffic, travel, all that stuff, and not having been in the river, I had to find that moment of, just calm within those moments. And then finally, when I was on the river yesterday, there was that calm that I missed, And when I got home, my daughter asked me, "Did you catch any fish?" I said, "No, because you stuck a banana sticker on me the night before on my jacket. Bananas are bad luck." And she laughed. That was just a joke. And then, and I said, "Well, what did you think about?" And I told her I thought about absolutely nothing. Not that I didn't think about anything, but my mind was empty, which, at least for me, for that moment in time, it was precious because I emptied my brain of a lot of things. Although I do say I did something which I hadn't done for a while, and I fished a technique yesterday that I struggled with. And I had to focus on that challenge because I couldn't get it done right. But after I did, I figured it out. I was in peace again. So you get these little moments of tension because there's a lot of chaos, and then you got to adjust, and then just finding that moment of, oh, I'm in the groove again, and then you feel, as much as we can say, like you said, hokey, but at one, with where you're at, and it's something really that I don't know if many people can find that. I hope they could.
There's a woman, I think her name is Karen Armstrong, and she was a nun and was assigned to study prayer. And at some point, her study of prayer led her to want to study things beyond prayer. And the church told her no, that was not her purpose. And she felt so strongly about it, she left the church. And I heard her interviewed one day, and she said through all of her study of different forms of all kinds of things, she'd come to the conclusion that anything done to the point of total concentration is a form of prayer, so that you could concentrate on your rosary beads and saying your rosary and get yourself into a cadence that becomes prayer. But you'll also find hiking, as you're walking along, that cadence can become very peaceful. And next thing you know, you're noticing things you didn't notice before. And talk about when you're faced with like a 150-yard or 300-yard run, and you're going to start making casts and swinging it. I would personally argue that you want to pay attention to special points in there and cover them with a slightly different cast. But there's still a cadence to that brings you peace. And if you add to that, oh my God, this moment I step in water, I'm just, the pressure. I used to harass my ex that if I can get a little jacked up once in a while, and I'd say, all you gotta do is touch me. I'm just a dog. Just put a finger on me. I have contact. And that contact can be wind, that can be water, that can be all kinds of, it could be my dog brushing up against me, and I'm happy as a clam and I'm peaceful.
I like that you used the term cadence there. I think that's really suits it well. Kind of on a weird tangent here, but something that drives me crazy is the fan above our oven. And, you're cooking, you got to run that thing. The second that thing gets turned off, I get this like very quick wash of that overwhelms me of just calm. And that is exactly the same feeling I get when I step into a river that's moving the right speed where steelhead like to hang out. And I've been blessed at certain times in my life, probably not recently, to be able to link up a bunch of fishing days in a row. Someone goes on a week-long fishing vacation, 8-10 hours a day, 5, 6, 7 days in a row, boom, they're fishing. You can get into this rhythm that it just becomes so natural, and you just feel so connected to what's going on. And to hear you talk about, Adrian, you had some time off. You took some time off with the family, but then you just had to step back into the river, and you were fairly quickly able to get back into that zone. Athletes talk about being in a zone. This is perhaps similar. But it's just this feeling of I think the tension and the release of tension, and then the cadence of just the rhythm of the whole thing, and the way time travels or the way time passes when you're in the river casting is crazy, isn't it? That 10-hour day goes by like that.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing about rivers. Because I fish in salt. I've fished, and we all have fished. But for some reason, that water moving, and just the hope of steelhead, it's given me that sense of peace that nothing else has, or that rhythm. However, I was going to ask you two, have you ever been, in that groove, in that rhythm, but sometimes you step into a run and you just know that the steelhead are there, and it gives a different feeling within that groove. It's like an excitement level that you're like, oh, they're here, but you're still in the groove. You're not like spazzing out, but it's like, it's going to grab right now. I'm sure that's happened to you guys.
Some of my favorite memories are those moments you're certain there's a fish in front of you, and then you catch it. There's nothing about the moment, the river at that moment, that you would say, you wouldn't lay money on it, but you just know there's a fish in front of you, and you're fishing well, and you're going to catch that fish.
And nothing's changed at all, but you just have that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it's how many times do you hear it where people say, "Oh, I knew I was going to get one," and you could rationalize it and say, "Oh, it was the speed of the water was familiar, or whatever it was." But we've all been there, and that confidence that you have, and maybe it's triggered by a smell, maybe just the fact that you recognize the river's conditions are perfect. There's something there that is familiar, and it gives you that, like you say, that knowledge that something good's about to happen. And maybe it's energy. I don't know.
Well, I think in some way it relates to that same thing about, do pissed off people catch fish? I think if you're quiet enough, I didn't grow up with dogs. I got, when my kid's mom and I went through a divorce, the first thing we told my kids, my younger daughter was the first of the kids to speak, and I was just destroyed. And my daughter looked at me and says, "Dad, does this mean we're finally getting a dog?" And I said, "As soon as I can find a place to live, we're getting a dog." And we did. And I've had 2 dogs for 30 some years now. And one of the things, especially I had a dog, Finn, who the whole family laughed about, was my dog. And I don't know why, but she and I were just joined at the hip. And there'd be times I never had to ever on a leash. We'd be out snowshoeing at 11 o'clock at night in the wintertime. Well, I was snowshoeing in the winter, yes. And I'd just feel a pull, and I'd look, and she'd be 80 yards away in the moonlight staring at me. And I would just hold a hand up to her, and she'd happily go off. But I could feel the pull. I could feel her looking at me. And I think there's things going on that civilization have tamped down in us that we don't begin to understand. And I think the more peaceful you are, the longer you're outside for extended periods, the more you can I don't want to say tap into that, but experience that a little bit.
So here's an interesting one, and I'm definitely getting off topic a little bit, but it feels like it's worth mentioning.
I didn't get the topic list. Did you send that?
We didn't. I never ever make one.
Me neither.
I got a guy I'm doing a show with tomorrow with some other folks. Travis Bader is his name, and I really like Travis. He's got a podcast himself. Everyone's a podcaster now, right? But Travis has been doing it a long time. Silvercore, and my oldest son has autism, and Travis said, "Hey, you got to check out this podcast called the Telepathy Tapes." And there's different styles of podcasts. There's like we're just hanging out and talking, and this one is more of it's kind of like a show. But anyways, the short version is it's about how certain kids who are on the spectrum can communicate with a parent without talking, and the podcast is crazy. I mean, it can't be fake, and it's certainly not something that affects a lot of people. But to think that this might be possible, and then you bring that back to this idea, and I'm not suggesting the crazy notion that we're communicating with the fish, but why the heck is it that people who are pissed off don't catch fish? It makes no sense. We can't rationalize it. We just know it happens. And so once again, anyone listening, if you want to check it out, it's an interesting listen. It's called the Telepathy Tapes, and obviously you can find it anywhere there's podcasts. And I've been listening to a few of them.
My oldest granddaughter is on the spectrum someplace. And when she was probably 3, my daughter called now her ex and said, what's going on? Why did you buy her 12 movies? And he said, I didn't buy any movies. He goes, well, there's 12 movies on the Disney account. She can't do that. He said, well, I didn't do it. And so come to find out, at 3 years old, she had watched them log in to their iPads, go onto Disney, and sort through movies and go through the purchase process. And at 3 years old, she figured out how to do it for herself, looking over their shoulder. And she's just a wonderful kid. But now she loves watching the same movies over again. If she's watching on her iPad, she'll watch like a sentence that's her favorite sentence. And then she'll just hit it with her finger and the movie just screams past. And she'll go and watch another 2 or 3 sentences and then scan past this movie just so fast it makes you crazy to even look at it, and touch it and stop it at just the right place. That's and watch. Crazy. She watches the highlight reel, just like scanning. She'll watch like 15 movies. I don't know, 15 is probably too many, but she'll watch a couple of movies in like 10 minutes, just watching her favorite parts because she knows them so well. But she can function with that equipment so easily. So I don't begin to understand any of it.
That's fascinating.
So let's get political for a second. That's always fun. I want to talk about no. Just stick with me. Hard-hitting question for you: is fly fishing only a management tool? Should we have rivers that are fly fishing only?
I'm so glad this is where we're going with that question.
I was thinking like maybe because I just heard on the news that a certain president wanted to buy Greenland, and I was like, no, let's buy British Columbia. No, I'm kidding.
Whoa.
It's actually funny. Several years ago, I was listening to NPR back in the East in Rochester, and they had a guy on talking about the difference between Canadians and Americans, and I listened to this for about 20 minutes. I thought, oh my God, I think I'm Canadian. But it's funny. I wish it was that easy, because I would, but it's not. Can it be an effective management tool? I think it can be. And I think to an extent, like especially with steelheading or spay fishing, I do think it's less effective. It can get nearly as effective. If you fished behind Adrian, you can see how devastatingly effective it can be. But it takes, I guess I'd say probably more effort per fish. And so you're going to slow the catch rate down. I don't think you can get through public approval enough people to go for it to have substantive effect.
Okay, so here's where I'm going with this whole thing. And I'm talking BC. I don't know anything about what happens south of the border. I'm not going to pretend to have strong opinions for what you guys should be doing. Up here, our managers don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox. And when we have periods of low abundance, people get concerned. So we got to do something. There's not as many fish as there should be. What are we going to do? Well, the one lever they have to pull is a closure. So then they close. And I have a fairly strong opinion that there's not a lot of examples of rivers that a closure has had a positive influence on fish numbers. I'm of the opinion that anglers generally are pretty low impact. And I'm of the opinion that anglers who tie their flies in hand and fish bamboo rods and dry lines have a really, really low impact. But is it fair to say that, God forbid, let me use the Thompson as an example. So the Thompson got closed due to low returns. And those low returns are based on an estimate off of a test fishery, which is essentially a gill net that catches and kills a certain number of fish. There's a multiplier. So those dead fish get extrapolated out into a run size estimate. Okay, so we can't have a fishery. Now, when the Thompson's open, you can fish with floats, you can fish with spoons, you can bottom bounce. It wasn't even that long ago you could do this all with eggs as well. What if they turned around and said, hey, the Thompson can be open, but you can only fish a dry line. You can't fish, Niska can't fish a sink tip. You can't fish a weighted fly, just dry line only, and that's it. I believe what we would be doing, first off, is we'd be giving a lot of fish sanctuary. The second thing that we'd be doing is limiting participation, because there's not a lot of people that, have the confidence to fish that way. And then the third thing is, of course, even the ones that are good at it aren't going to catch that many fish. We get all the social and economic benefits of having anglers on the water, not the least of which is the fact that it dissuades poaching. But also there's a scientific side to this too, because, hey, this is going to give you a better idea of what's there. It creates an opening for scale sampling and all sorts of other good things. But is it fair? I'm going to piss off some people by saying this. I've got another idea we're going to go to after this, but I wanted to get you guys to jump in real quick as guys who like to fish a dry line. This, to me, is a logical tool that the managers should have in their toolbox, or is it just too unfair?
From my heart, I think it's a good tool. As an example is the North Umpqua, river, because there's a fly-only section, the upper part of the North Umpqua River, and people are limited in what they can do on that section, and it protects the fish. You can't use weights on that river like they did in the past, so I think it's an effective management tool. Is it fair? Now, the lower regions of the North Umpqua, they can fish gear. Unfortunately, there's certain pinch points that they fish it too effectively. There's a dam there on the lower portion, but it's tough because you will piss people off, but it does give a chance for us to see how well the fish are doing and also limits our interaction with the fish. Boy, that's a good one. I don't know. What do you think, Rick?
It's funny, down on the North Umpqua, at the campground a couple years ago, my neighbor and his family, he is a firefighter in San Francisco, super nice guy, with this adorable family, his wonderful wife and these two little kids that, I ended up, trading flies with the kids. But, it was funny, after we'd visited a couple of days, he, out of the blue, he said, there's a whole bunch of people in this campground pissed off at you. I'm like, I don't think I know anybody else in this campground. Why are they pissed off at me? He says, because the most recent podcast. I'm like, oh shit, I didn't even think of that. And the most recent podcast had been, people from Native Fish and, Conservation Angler talking about closing the fish hatchery down there after the fire because the hatchery got destroyed. And, there's a whole bunch of people down there that want that hatchery because their idea was that if there's no hatchery, there's no fish. And, I'm pretty firmly that, with occasional rare exceptions, I'm anti-hatchery. I think if hatcheries were effective, we wouldn't have any return problems right now because they've been around for like 150 years. I think there are times in reestablishing populations that have been wiped out that they can be effective, but for the most part, I think they've proven to not be effective. And, but to get people engaged, to learn enough, to want more information and to make an informed policy choice I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you get people to, like right down here, you said when we first went down this path, you said we're going to talk politics. And right now in our country, you can't. Both sides are so furious with each other. And the funny thing is, I just saw a thing. There's a guy. Oh, I wish I could think of his name. He's recording conversations between people who identify right and left to help them find common ground. And I can still remember years ago, there was an earthquake. I can't remember where, in a foreign country where people were, look very different than you and I. And, they're trying to interview this guy and he's coming unglued, and he just turns to him and says, I just want to find my children. And they wouldn't leave. That's all he cared about. That's all he could think about. And they're trying to stick a microphone in his face, get an opinion from him. And I think that, people just love their kids. Leave them alone. Help them. Put your camera down and go help him find his kids. Go help him dig out of the rubble. We wouldn't fish for steelhead if we didn't love steelhead. How do you get people to realize just because you paid for a license doesn't mean you're owed a fish, doesn't mean you get to kill 2 fish, 5 fish, 10 fish, 15 fish, doesn't mean you need to limit out every time you go. How do you get people to understand there's so many more people fishing now, so much more effectively than they were in the past, that we can't treat the resource the way we have in the past? So yes, I think it could be an effective tool. It can be an effective tool. But how do we get the information out there to get people to come along and understand why? To understand that you got to bring more to the game.
So here's another strategy is, okay, well, what if you didn't get into the tackle box? What if instead you made it illegal to catch more than 2 steelhead in a day, but you could fish whatever the way you wanted? We're still going to minimize the number of fish being caught. We're still going to lower participation, which will in turn lower the number of fish being caught. The best way to reduce catch and release mortality is to catch less fish. You can make a pretty good argument that also limiting the number of times a fish gets caught over and over again, so the whole repeat capture scenario. But I guess my big thing right now that bugs me is the NGO landscape, which perpetuates this idea that we're in a state of crisis. And because we have a crisis, the government needs to do something. And the danger of that is often that leads to the hatchery discussion. But the science shows that there's not really any examples of wild runs that have been recovered through hatchery intervention. The science shows that if the habitat's there, the fish will use it. The science shows that you can build a hatchery run if you have the funds to pay for it. You don't need a ton of habitat to do that if you have the dough. But you can't have both at the same time. It just doesn't work. And I guess that gives us 2 products, if you will. You've got, and I'll go back to my examples earlier, where I grew up. We got the Squamish for the wild fish aficionados. Low catch rates, lots of space. We got the Vetter. There's more fish. You're going to have a lot of company. You might get downholed. And I guess, when it comes down to it, some people would make the argument, and I think it's fair, that fly fishing only is discriminatory because someone has to be able to cast a fly rod. And we've got a leg up because we're all fairly decent at it. So maybe the fairest way to manage a dwindling resource is to spread it as wide as possible through catch and release limits, but they're hard to enforce, aren't they?
I think that I like the idea of having a 1 or 2 fish limit, but how many people do you know that would self-police that?
It's got to be an educational thing, right? Or a cultural thing. It's tough to make it a regulation.
When I was fortunate enough to meet Lee Spencer down there on the North Umpqua, I don't. Are you aware of him?
I'm not. The name sounds familiar, but I'm not aware. So please educate.
He was the keeper of the dynamite hole.
Oh, I got to tell you. Do you guys know Darcy Baca?
Yeah.
I know who he is. I don't know.
Okay, great. Darcy's been on our show a couple times. Darcy's a good buddy of mine. Episode 4, which might be my favorite podcast I've ever done. I had Darcy Baca and Daniel Pendergrass, 2 snowboard photographers that never met each other, but they ran in the same circle. It's just slightly different ages. And I asked them, what was your favorite photo you ever took? And Darcy's favorite photo was a photo he took with Lee, and he told the whole story of Lee. So I'm sorry I jumped in there, but I wanted to pitch that out there.
It's actually funny. My first visit with Lee, I stayed like 3.5 hours up underneath his tarp looking at his pool of fish and just talking about steelhead. And it's actually one of my favorite fishing photos I've ever taken. I fished with him the next day and his dog Sis, and I got a picture of Sis in the foreground with Lee making a cast in the background and gave it to him as a thank you for for taking me fishing, because that was my first intro to the North Umpqua. Was third day I was there, Lee Spencer showed me like 6 runs. But he fished without a point on his hook. He would leave the bend on the hook, but he'd cut the point off and file it round so he could use it as a hook keeper, or as a keeper, so he could keep his rod strung up. But he fished without, and I keep, talking about the whole meditative part of fishing. I keep hoping I can evolve to that, but I'm not sure I'll ever be able to, because I still like to catch fish.
Well, Richard, if you've listened to some of our previous episodes, I had this discussion with Tim in April. I had this discussion with Kenny Morrish, Bunky, Dax, a bunch of people. I think what we should have done on the Thompson when numbers got low is taken away the hook points. We should have still let the anglers go fishing just for bites.
Would it be interesting to me how many people would still fish?
I think we'd be surprised. I think a lot of people, remember when we started this conversation, you got the social aspect, the camaraderie, you're still out there, you're in the river. Those fish are still going to come up and eat your dry flies. You just don't have to reel them in, and you don't get a photo. Who cares? But you're still there, and you're still contributing, and you still have that history, that tradition. And I'm getting a little passionate about it because I'm concerned about this as a middle-aged guy. The Thompson's been closed long enough that we've lost that tradition. The younger anglers, there's guys who've been spay casting 10 years who've never fished it. They didn't get that experience.
Oh, I've never seen it. Yeah.
So what happens now? So what happens next year, the year after, whenever that test net suddenly runs into 30 or 40 steelhead, and all of a sudden they say, okay, guys, the fish are back. We're going to drop the rope. Everybody can go fishing. Do we have an American-style opening where the river suddenly opens on November 1st and the fish have been sitting there marinating and all of a sudden they get over the head with everything? Is that a better situation than to have anglers just a constant pressure?
They're all going to be caught then.
Yeah, to have a constant presence of anglers, I think, is better, and to have that tradition. And there's the waterbed effect. When we have these fisheries that get closed, it pushes pressure to other areas. So I think that as anglers, we really need to help guide managers to find alternatives to closures when we have periods of low abundance. But at the same time, we need to work hard as anglers to minimize our impacts, even if that means fishing without hooks.
I totally agree. The Thompson is one of those rivers that sit in I've never fished it. I've driven past it. But just the lore, the people that have fished that river, the majestic strain of steelhead in that river that come up all the way to the surface, that gnaws on me. And I've thought before, if I was able to fish that river, even with a hookless tube fly, I'd love to do that. But, now that you bring that up, the passion comes out of me, because it's like, of course, fly fish limit the options that we can, cause harm to these fish. And like you said, not like have an opening where then all of a sudden all the people, all the steelhead anglers, all the community wants to go over there all at the same time and fish that river. To me, what you propose makes sense at this point.
To me, it goes back to, I do think fly fishing has a reputation of being elitist, which I think is really too bad, because it's more affordable to get into it now than it's ever been. I mean, there's more expensive stuff than there's ever been, but there's also cheaper stuff than there's ever been. So it doesn't need to be a dollar barrier keeping people out of it. I think the learning curve is harder for the most part. And centerpin guys will say it's harder to learn to cast a centerpin rod than it is a spay rod. I don't care. That doesn't make any difference to me. It's less effective than the centerpinning.
It's all about catch rates.
Yeah. And I get the impression that you guys up there have the same problem I'm afraid we have down here, that our resource managers are not managing with the same goals in mind that we would wish they had. I'm not convinced that Fish and Wildlife Services are that invested in wild fish. They have a model of fish hatcheries, and the people in management positions now have come up through the whole fish hatchery model. Is that just managing that model, or is it looking to manage the resource effectively? And when does it get to the point where fishing is any different than any other extractive resources, and that's what's being managed for is the hatch rate? How much of our hatchery system is taken up by commercial fishing out in the ocean? How much of the salmon and steelhead are swept up, in ocean nets? And we have no idea what, our license fees have paid for hatcheries where we'd be better off putting those in and realizing that each stream has a carrying capacity. Putting more fish in there doesn't do anything effective, doesn't do anything positive.
So, guys, I've had a couple great conversations with John McMillan now on the show, and John is a really unique individual because, he's got credibility in the science world, and he's got that network, but he's also a legit steelhead angler, and a lot of times, people kind of live in one world or the other, but he's got experience on both sides. And he made the exact same point you just did there, Richard, that it's so expensive to produce these fish that essentially we're talking about taxpayer dollars. They go out to the ocean. We don't know where they end up. Maybe that same, resource, taxpayer dollars, could be better applied to the healthcare system or elsewhere. But we don't really have a good understanding, or at least your average Joe Bag of Donuts doesn't have a great understanding of what it costs to produce these fish, where they end up. And I don't think from a management side, they take into account the amount of dollars per fish generated. And where I'm going with this is if I go out and I catch a fish every 10 days, hopefully I do a little better than that, versus someone who goes out and catches 10 fish in a day, I'm generating a lot more economic impact than that person is on a per fish basis. And when we're talking catch and release, we could also have another conversation about, how do we minimize our own impact when it comes to catch and release mortality? So I think we've moved the needle quite a bit on this in the last couple decades. The fish photography now is primarily in the water. We're using barbless hooks. People are cognizant of how they're playing fish, how they handle fish. I think we've done good things to catch and release mortality to a pretty good kind of 5%. But could we do better? Sure. But if you're telling me that there's a river south of the border where, it's fly fishing only above a certain point, but below there, it's anything goes, and these very same fish are being subjected to crazy high catch rates with gear that's got a higher catch and release mortality, but then a little further upstream, they're managing them in a really sustainable way. There's something totally disjointed and broken there.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that's very true. And talking about the keeping fish wet, there's a whole Instagram account of steelhead, and probably 1 in 20 pictures on that are fish in the water. They're people setting up their iPhone, holding their picture up, their cam, and they'll say it was only out of the water for 15 seconds. It doesn't need to come out of the water, especially now your iPhone's waterproof. Stick your phone underwater and take a picture.
Yeah.
But there was, I saw several pictures over in the Clearwater this year of people landing fish, netting them into the boat, keeping them in the bottom of the boat while they got all set up, they probably had the fish out of water for several minutes and then release the fish. And they'll say, it swam away fine. It swam away. That doesn't mean it swam away fine. Well, I guess the point I'm trying to make is I think we're kind of in a silo of people who have the interests that we do. And so our idea of keep fish wet and maybe run sections for fly fishing only to control. But we are the vast minority of anglers. We are a tiny percentage of steelhead fishermen. The vast majority of steelheaders are gear and float fishermen and stuff like that. And I don't want to say they all don't have the same concerns, but a lot of them don't have the same concerns. When I first moved here, I went to a meeting. I live in Oregon City. The falls and the Willamette are right here in town, and they're a big barrier to fish passage. Before there were dams upstream, fish used to migrate. When the river was so flooded, they could swim right over the falls. And it's the second biggest waterfall in the United States. It's a big water. It's not a huge drop. It's not like Niagara Falls, which is so tall and wide, but it's a wide drop, and it's a fish barrier, except when the spring floods are coming through. And that's why they only had winter run of fish. In the summer, the falls were too steep. So they're trying to get resources to manage the fish passage better, and trying to hold ODFW's feet to the fire on getting more feeder streams available. So I went to this meeting with Native Fish Society, and I just sat down in an open seat. And I didn't realize I sat down in the middle of people who don't just despise the Native Fish Society. They hate the Native Fish Society with red hot passion. And it was the vast majority of the room. I don't agree with everything Native Fish Society does, but I like what they're trying to do overall. I like their mission. How we make the tent bigger is, I think, the struggle. how you get even people within. Because when I had so much pushback at Susan Creek down in North Umpqua, it wasn't gear guys. It was all fly guys up in the fly zone that were mad at me. Nobody would come talk to me about it. Nobody would sit and have a conversation about why I felt the way I did, because I'll sit and talk about it all day long. But they want to say, so-and-so says this. I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how hatcheries have proven ineffective. But nobody wants to do that. They want to say, I want to catch as many fish as I did when I was 14. It's a long time since I was 14 and could catch a limited fish and feel good about it.
Brian, is there a harvest mentality of steelhead up in your neck of the woods, or is it, because that seems to be an underlying theme here in the lower 48. It's, they want to catch steelhead, they want to harvest it, and make a meal out of it or stock their freezer.
Yeah, what's the point of fishing if I can't eat it?
Yeah. So,
all right. So here on the Skeena, steelhead are all wild. It's now illegal in BC to retain a wild steelhead. It's surprisingly not that long ago that there were certain rivers where you were able to kill a wild steelhead, but that's not the case anymore. So now you're confined on a harvest side to hatchery rivers. The Vetter's the granddaddy of them. It's not the only one. There's a couple others throughout the province of BC. But hey, I think the reality is hatcheries are expensive to run, and we just don't have the dollars to do it. And we're also blessed to have a really small population and lots of open space. And the secret sauce of the Skeena is the fact that there's so much water spread out. The system's so diverse. The fish are so diverse, different age classes. We don't have huge numbers of fish per mile. People down south are really surprised to hear how few fish we have. And I'll tell you right now, over the last 70 years, the average run size for the entire Skeena system is just ever so slightly larger than 30,000 fish, okay? Twice in that same time period, we've had estimated returns over 60,000, escapement over 60,000. It's not that many fish when you take into the size of the area. So what we learned from this is that, there's natural fluctuations in run size. Fairly recently, 2021, we had the lowest. Previous to that, the next lowest, I think, was 57, so it goes back a ways. In the early 90s, we had a very similar period of low abundance. And okay, here's the most interesting thing about it. The average age of a returning Skeena steelhead is 6 years old, okay? 4 years fresh, 2 years salt. That's your average fish. There's a lot of variation there. They could be all over the map, but that's the most common one. 91, 92, 93. Three of the lowest Skeena returns on record. 98 and 99, two of the highest Skeena returns on record. How's your math? So what we learned from this is that the progeny could fare exceptionally well. And I think part of that on the Skeena is the situation that when you have a low returning number of adults and you have all this habitat, there's a lot of groceries there. There's not as much competition. And the challenge when we start talking about hatchery programs is we're trying to increase survival from egg to smolt, or God forbid, a fry program. And what do you end up with that? Well, you end up with this slug of out-migration of fish that create a boom in predators. And I think it even speaks to just behavior on a fish-by-fish basis. And where I'm going with that is, if a fish is raised in a raceway, it's used to, not chasing food sideways. A wild fish, which is going through the whole natural selection thing, that sucker needs to bust a move to get fed. So I think there's a reason that guys who swing flies catch more wild fish than hatchery fish on rivers where there is that mixed system. And I think its simple explanation is the fact that you have a situation where these fish have to compete, and that's important.
Well, and if you have the natural cycle of smolt in the river and parr in the river, and it's what essentially the population of the river has been for several centuries or more, and then you dump more in, all of a sudden all those fish are competing at even higher level. Even if their competition is not as able as them, they're outdone by numbers. And it's going to make it harder for those wild fish to survive. The other part of it is, if a river could produce more fish, I think it would.
Yeah.
If it has enough food to support parr and smolt, I think there'd be more there. So putting more in is just stressing all the ones that are already there more. And I think part of that is getting to the point where we recognize that everybody can't catch all the fish they want to catch. You have to recognize that if you kept 6 fish this year, maybe that's your share.
Mm-hmm. So, gosh, well, I could talk to you guys for hours, but we should probably find a nice way to finish this and get out of the political thing, because my blood is boiling right now thinking about all the lost opportunity. But it is frustrating because you think, okay, well, we've got this tremendous resource. It's vastly misunderstood. It's vastly devalued. And, to me, the answer is so simple. And that's basically just you need to find ways to minimize the catch rate. And fly fishing only is a tool for that. It's maybe not the only one. On previous shows, we've talked about limited entry, kind of like the ZEC system in Quebec. But I kind of have a problem with that because I've enjoyed this free access in BC, and I don't know if I want to make reservations to go fishing.
Well, and there's in New York, when I first started on the Salmon River, you could fish any place you wanted. Now the lower stretch is all private. And they'll say, yeah, you can get under for $50 a day. I'm like, why do I want to pay $50 a day to fish next to people? I don't want private entry.
Cheaper than a round of golf.
Well, yeah, I don't have to worry about that. You know what I like about golf? It keeps people off rivers.
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, so I'd like to wrap up the show with two things. I want to give you guys another opportunity to let people know how to find you and promote anything that you want to promote, whatever that is. But I do have a couple of questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Adrian with a couple, and then I'll move to you, Richard.
I might have opinions on Adrian's answers.
Well, that's why we're starting with him. So, Adrian, you're approaching legend status. I mean, I didn't even know you before today, but I certainly knew of you.
He's like traveling with a celebrity on the fly fishing circuit.
Well, here's why. Because he's established some rules and he's sticking to them. He's made fly fishing, which is pretty hard to begin with, even harder. And he's not, he's not interested in making it any easier. But he's getting the most enjoyment as he can on a per fish basis by doing it on his terms, and I absolutely love that. But Adrian, if there's anyone listening who wants to get into dry fly fishing for steelhead or wants to try and tie a fly in their hand, can you give them a couple of knowledge bombs here on how to get started so they don't get super frustrated and they can set themselves up for success? Could be anything. That's what I'd love for you to share. And then, Richard, my question for you is actually a little more broader. And it's, I admire the heck out of you because you're a guy who's managed to make a living doing things you love. You're a painter, you're a podcaster, you've greatly influenced me with this podcast. So what can you share with people about following their dreams and then also maybe trying to find a way to tie in, time on the water to help achieve those goals? So we'll start with you, Adrian, and then we'll finish up with Richard. And don't forget to plug yourself. I want to hear that art website before we're done again.
First, I want to say I'm no legend. I really just enjoy the culture of fly fishing. And I mentioned before the traditions. I think I just actually read Hate Brown this morning, and he said something to the effect that you want to respect the fish by the way that you angle for them. And that's what I really want to do with a steelhead. Is I want to respect their journey, the what they have to go through from being smolt back out to the ocean and then to come back in again and spawn and then go back out. That's an amazing journey that they have to go through. And so as far as dry fly fishing, dry line fishing, I think it for me, and I hope to share it with some people, is that they find that challenge, that enjoyment out of it. It's not an easy road, especially if you don't have a mentor. And I've been fortunate that I was intrigued by dry line fishing, that I met with a good buddy of mine, Todd Hirano. And, and through him, I got to meet Bill McMillan. Getting Bill McMillan's book, Dry Line Steelhead and Other Subjects, and just going through that, you don't have to read through the whole thing, but just a few of the excerpts just could provide some passion, some inspiration, some data. And then finding another fellow that enjoys a dry line or dry fly fishing, because you need to have some sort of encouragement, because if you've never done it before, you don't have something to draw from, and you can get easily discouraged and put on your sink tip again. There's nothing wrong with sink tip fishing, under the right conditions. Just dry line steelhead, put your dry line on and then fish all summer with it. Steelhead will come up to the surface. You don't have to go deep. Those are active fish. As far as dry flies, I personally enjoy natural style dry flies. I still say the grease liner is the greatest steelhead fly of all time, just because of the conception of it from Harry Lemire, one of the great tying legends, icons of steelheading. And it's effective and it's simple. Tie on a grease liner. But if you want to tie a foam fly, a foam tube, do it. It'll work. And just stick to it. That's how I started. And then I hook a fish, and I was surprised, but pretty soon you'll be successful. You'll start knowing the holding lies. And like you mentioned earlier, Brian, steelhead don't hold deep. They're pretty shallow. I've had them in ankle deep water. You just have to be observant. You have to be cautious. Like Harry Lemire, he said you have to stalk them like a heron. You can't go clunking around, right into the pool. You have to stop at the top of the pool and start, fishing from the bank, not in the water. And just observe what you're doing every day. And as far as tying in hand, it's a different challenge. One of the reasons was other people inspired me. And I realized, wow, there's more connection to this tying and then to the steelhead once I tie something in hand. And it gives me a sense of excitement. But just start with a simple spade pattern, just dub some small hook, and then wrap some hackle around it and use that. Start with that. You're going to hook a fish on it, and then you can say, wow, I did that, hook the fish, and next time add a wing. Simple stuff, strip wings. It doesn't need to be fantastic. And then, you'll find out soon enough if you want to, challenge your way in that part of fly fishing. Others, it may be too much of a distraction. For me, it gives me that sense of focus, like Rick was mentioning earlier. It allows me time when I'm off the water to think about steelhead, and also gives me something that I'm satisfied about once I take it to the water. There are a few good tying videos, I believe, online. You just Google, tying in hand on YouTube. There's a few fellas that'll show you how to tie in hand. Off the top of my head, it's Jinwoo Lee. But it really is something that you have to get used to. It's hard to watch a video and tie in hand. You just got to do it. But that's really me in a nutshell. I just try to hopefully promote steelheading to the funnest it can be. We can dredge for them. We can use bobbers for them. But for me, it's a dead drifting a dry fly, swinging a dry fly, seeing that surface attack, or maybe tying, a hook, dry lining a hook in the winter with minimal materials, and then getting a fish to come up in the upper part of the water column and just, yank that hook. It just sends a shot of energy through you. But yeah, that's hopefully that'll help some people on their angling. And I do donate some of my flies to Native Fish Society, and also to Fly Fishing Collaborative. But they also, what they do is they through the fly fishing community, they try to raise funds to help those in need, in underprivileged children. They fight human trafficking in our country as well as other countries. So it's a great organization, good people behind it. And and also one more thing is, I want to learn how to paint. And so, because I get inspired by Richard and other painters. He mentioned James Samsel. So when I can't fish, I'll sit down and I have one brush. That's all I have. And I thought, you know what? I think I could try this out with one brush, with watercolor. So I tried something once, and my wife took one look at it, and she said, that looks like a sandwich. And it was supposed to be like, it was supposed to be a river with a desert in the background, the desert hills. And anyway, I hope next time to paint more than a sandwich. So
that's awesome. And if someone wanted to get a hold of you, do you talk to people?
Mostly they send me like messages on Instagram, Adrian Cortes Steelhead. What else do I have? I think that's mainly the most part. I'll be on Spay pages as Fishin' Asian, which is FSHANASIAN. what is it? I can't even spell. FSHNAZN.
No vowels.
That's awesome. And I love the tip about setting yourself up for success by not trying to tie a complicated fly at the beginning, but just trying to get a few materials on there and then take it fishing and then build upon that. I think that's a wonderful tip. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Brian.
Okay, Richard, you're up.
I already forgot my question. Like I said, I never intended to do this. It was a lifeboat for me. I love to paint. I absolutely love to paint. When I'm coming unglued, I need to make something, and painting is what does it for me most. It just grounds me. I don't even know if it's satisfying as much as absorbing to do. But what it really takes to make a living at it is this full-time hustle. So the problem is there's no path to follow. You've got to be willing to dive in. If I could I've found a mentor. One of the things that's been fascinating to me on the podcast is almost everybody I've run into that's in the industry had a mentor that had them, kind of led them down the path. I never in my life ran into that. It's just, I don't want to say bad luck. It's just the chaos of the world. I never had that good fortune. I've had a lot of other good fortune. My kids are my anchors. I've had times in my life where I didn't know what I was going to do. And I thought, but I have kids. I got to move. You got to move forward. You have responsibilities to the people you love. The other great blessing in my life is my friends. My two fishing buddies back east, Coop and Magic. We've been friends for 30 years. From paddling, some of my best friends. So when I wasn't fishing, I was running whitewater, and there's not too many do or die situations in fishing, but there are in paddling. And the guys I paddled with, I don't paddle much anymore, but I'm going to be friends with those guys till I die. My buddy Driscoll walked into the fly shop I ran 47 years ago and said, "How's it going?" And I said, "Good. How you doing?" He said, "Good." We've been friends ever since. I used to fish almost always alone. And when I moved out here and met Adrian, he introduced me to a group of guys, and I met some guys through the Drake. I met some guys on my own that, it's a really tight, close community, and art is the same way. I have kind of 2-3 bodies of friends. I have my old paddling buddies, my fishing buddies, and my painter friends, and not all painters, sculptors, jewelers, all kinds of stuff. And it's that common interest, that common thought process about life that is the basis of friendships that just kind of sustain us. And I think it's way more important than what you do with your time. It's really inappropriate, I guess, socially to ask people what they do. I guess when people say, "Oh, you're an artist," and they always think that's loaded, I'm like, I'm a small business guy. What I am is a small business guy who makes and sells something that is completely unnecessary for almost everyone. It's really funny. It's Dan Ritz is involved in Swing the Fly. and I can't remember exactly what he said to me, but how do you sell your work or something like that? And I said, the funny thing is I have people all the time that like my work, and they won't say it that way, but they don't value my work. And I recognize part of my work has gotten to a point where I don't even like to say out loud how much it costs. But one of the reasons I do printmaking is it's pretty affordable. But there's still people that $400 or $500 or $600 is too much money for them to spend. They buy things that cost that much all the time, but they won't spend that money on art because they don't value it that way. And that's fine. It's not my place to tell you what you should value. I would say you should value your friends, your family, your kids, and your spouse and your friends. But beyond that, it's up to you. I drive a 20-year-old truck with 320,000 miles on it, and I have fly rods that will make wealthy men faint because they're so nice. Because I value that. I value things that people make by hand. I have 2 Schamberg reels. He made everything down to the springs and the screws that hold the reels together. I have several bamboo rods from James Reed, from Chris Obachowski, from Patrick Lukabaugh, Jay Moon. I can't wait to get my hands on a Schamberg. They make every part of it. I love that. I value their labor. And so I'm willing to save my pennies and pay for it. And that's what I want my life to be about. And that to me is more about, it takes a lot of hustle. You won't talk to anybody who does that and makes a living doing that doesn't have to hustle their ass off. I know running a lodge has got to be a lot of work.
Well, let's not worry about that right now. But what I'm picking up from you is and I'll bring this back to fishing. It's all about making another cast and keep it moving through the pool, and eventually you're going to find a taker.
Yeah, you just got to keep moving. It is kind of funny. I know several artists in the same situation that, as the economy goes up and down, right as I got to a point where I thought, I finally figured this out. 14 years ago, we had a huge housing collapse down here, financial collapse down here. And I don't know if it hit Canada the same way, but it tanked. It tanked the economy down here. And I used to I painted much smaller, and I sold to a different group of people. And those people have almost not ever returned to buying art again, because I think it hit them so hard financially. And at the same time, the painting that I love for the most part is enormous. And I've always wanted to paint bigger. And I started painting bigger because I wasn't doing anything. And all of a sudden I started selling paintings again, and it occurred to me, oh, really wealthy people, they're always really wealthy. And so finding your market, identifying your market, having faith in your ability to reach that market, all of that plays in. But mostly the thing is, don't quit.
I love it. So Richard, speaking of buying art, how do people find your art and buy your art?
The most direct way is my website. There's just two websites. There is Richard C. Harrington. There are a lot of Richard Harringtons who paint. If you don't use my initial C in the middle, you'll find somebody else. But richardcharrington.com. And then the riverrambler.com has a little bit of painting on it too. But most of it's on richardcharrington.com. And some of it is available through me, but there's a page of representation on my website that shows the galleries that I show at.
Perfect. Well, guys, I really appreciate your time today. It's been wonderful speaking with you, and I hope I can encourage you to come up and see us on the Skeena sometime, and we can continue our talks on the water.
Oh, I can guarantee we would both love to.
Well, that was a fun discussion. I want to thank Richard and Adrian for sharing their knowledge and passion with us today. I'm not sure I'm going to be tying any flies in hand, but I'm definitely inspired to get on the water with a James Reed bamboo rod this season. Thank you to everyone for tuning into the show. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. You can find In the Bucket Podcast online at www.inthebucketpodcast.com. If you're on Instagram, you can follow us at In the Bucket Podcast. You can reach me directly on email at info@skeenaspay.com. Look for the next episode of In the Bucket coming your way in the first week of April. Until then, I'm host Brian Niska, and you've been listening to In the Bucket Podcast, brought to you by the Wet Fly Swing.